So Sam, are you using the baseline setup?
Yeah, so let me describe what we're going to do. Okay, so we're going to start with the baseline setup, just the high downforce, whatever it's called. What's it called?
High
iRacing
downforce.
setups, high downforce. And what we'll do is basically prove to you how fucking shockingly crap it is by looking at the data. All right? It will feel good, but it's not fast. And you'll see why when we look at the data. And what we'll essentially do is then modify that slightly, and I'll explain basically what the things that I initially modify when I'm making a set, the things that generally are more or less always the same when you're doing F3. And then we'll create some more data with the setups that we make, and it will start to feel good, but a bit shit because it will be oversteery here or understeery here, or be grinding out here. And we'll look back at the data and we'll make additional modifications based on what the data is telling us. And then we'll go out and make some more data. And when we make the data, what we really want to be doing, based on the idea that this tire model is really generally quite understeery and oversteery at the same time for about 2 laps, and then you kind of get a good lap and then another good lap. So what we're trying to do is basically when we go out to create data to look at, we'll try and do 4 laps: the out lap, the warm up lap, and then potentially one data lap, and then potentially another data lap, and just try and make the laps nice and smooth, not really trying to like push the car necessarily, but just create a nice smooth lap where you haven't gone off track, and that sort of thing. Does that make sense?
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah,
Okay.
10-4.
So what we'll do initially is then, load up high downforce, and let's all go and set allowing. This first bit might take a little bit of time because we haven't driven the track for a while, maybe. But let's just go out there, and when everybody is happy that they've set a representative
Pit lane speed limit is 60
lap,
kilometers per hour.
we'll then go forward and then start.
Pit exit is clear.
The data. All right.
Oh crap, we've just had a stop-go penalty.
Amazing.
Thanks for providing us with the info.
That's all right.
Yeah, this is awesome, Sam. Thanks.
Ron, you've got your
Looks
same,
like you're clear on the pit
the
exit.
same push to talk button as you have in game, so you're echoing. You'll need to produce a different one for Discord.
Okay, I'll reset that up.
And the downforce, the high downforce set has 45.5 liters. We'll just leave that as it is for now. We'll just go out at 45.45 liters.
Jesus.
Okay, clear, Sam.
Oh, damage is off, by the way. Damage is
All
off.
clear on pit exit, you can push now.
Well, someone's testing that out.
Yeah, give it a shot.
Yep, damage definitely off.
Upside down though.
I always do setups with damage off because if you're trying to create tire data, it really slows you down if you crash.
That makes a lot of sense.
Is that better, Sam?
Yes, that's good.
The leader has just done a 156.30. You'll need to give back the time gained. P5. Sector 1 is 1.1 seconds off the pace. The leader's just done a 155.66. The guy in front has just done a 159.65.
You still hear me?
Yes.
B6, that was a 158.67. Car right side's clear. Mind these track limits, please, Rossi.
So everyone sort of comes to the end of their run, and then we'll pull up some data and have a look at it. We just need to have done enough laps so that our tyres have warmed up. That's all we need, really.
So is lap time our comparison for setting it up so we can know the difference? Would you
No,
rather-
we don't need any comparison or anything. We just need to look at our own temperature data. I'm going to share my screen in a minute so you can, and I'll show you my temperature data and stuff. In a lot of ways, you can probably you'll just be able to see what I'm doing, talking about my tyre data, but it also helps that you're going to have your own as well, so you can look at it to confirm that I'm not just bullshitting. Oh, Twitch terms of service.
P9. You're a second off the pace in Sector 1. The leader has just done a 153.26. Track limits, they'll invalidate this lap.
Right, can everyone stop so we can do? We can look at the data.
You going to stream in Discord, Sam?
I will, yeah. Okay. There we go. Does everyone know how to watch the stream?
I don't know.
I think you just hover over my name and then you can like click watch stream or something.
Yeah, that's correct. Neat.
Anyone not see the stream?
No, I'm good. I can see it.
Okay. So I'm just gonna. I mean, I've got to, because we've got quite a few people here. I've just got to treat you all like complete noobs. Okay, is that right? So I'm on VRS. I'm going to click driving stats. I can see my most recent session here. Can you all see my mouse, by the way?
Yep, I can see it.
Yes.
Yeah, that's cool. So I'm going to click on this. Sorry?
How do I get to your scroll?
Yeah, you hover over my name, click watch live stream or watch stream, whatever it says.
Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, there's my most recent session. So I'm going to click on that. And I'm going to analyze session. I'm going to get rid of the comparison and just have a single lap. And I'm just going to pick, I basically did an out lap, I did a warm-up lap, and I just did one lap where I can be pretty sure that my tyres are warming at least. And I'm going to click on that one. This is where it differs between a free DRS set account and a premium one, because you have advanced telemetry mode on the paid for account. So I'm going to click on that. And I don't know if you can see here, it's got wheel slip and spin, tires, which is tire temperatures, tire advance, which just shows you the change in temperature over time, ride heights, damper histograms, and then a load of crap about your G forces and your traction, and then loads of stuff you just never ever use, like your gearbox traces, ERS and DRS, and various other crap that you're just never ever going to use. But what I use mostly is our tires, ride heights, damper histograms. So again, I'm just going to treat everybody like a noob. So I just like run through what this is. It doesn't really matter if you know what it is already or whatever. Some people probably won't. But you've got 4 graphs here at the top. At the bottom, you've got tire pressures. At the top, you've got tire temperatures. And you can see in the small here, it's left front, right front. Reed, could you use push to talk, please? If that is that right? Sounds like it's taking a peek. Left rear, right rear. You can see here, if you're looking where my arrow is looking, you've got the outside temperature, the middle temperature, and the inside temperature of each of those tires represented by these lines. Now, what you... Oh, God. I'm just going to kick him from the room. Reed, can you hear me? Hello? Oh, there we go. Good. So, can you... to make this not too laborious, can anyone tell me if they don't understand about cambers and stuff, why we put a camber on a tire? Does anyone not understand that? Or does everyone get it?
I've got it. I know.
I understand. I just don't know when you want more and when you want less.
Yeah. Okay. But okay, that's good. So yeah, does anybody not understand it? It doesn't matter if you don't.
Well, is it? I don't know. No, maybe not.
Okay, this is the point where I get let me stop streaming for a second because I need to swap it over to a different screen. Loads up. Here we go. It's coming up now. Can everyone see Microsoft Paint?
Yep.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay, I'll try and do this really, really quick. So, looking sort of from above, here's a car, yeah, etc. I'm going to concentrate on this tire, and I'm going to like put the camera down on the ground, looking forwards at the front tire. Okay, so here's the body of the car, here's the suspension, here's the tire. Aren't my drawing skills fantastic? So, when your car is going through a corner, so your car is turning to the left, it's going to roll to the right, and this tire is going to roll in this direction, going more onto the outside edge of the tire. And that means in this temperature graph, your outside temperature would be like this because the car is leaning on this and it's lifted the inside off the tarmac. So your inside temperature would look like this, your middle temperature would look like this, and your outside temperature would be the highest. In order to remedy that, what we do is we angle the tire inwards like this, so that most of the time, just the inside edge is mostly in contact with the ground. But when you go through a left-hand turn and the whole car rolls, this rolls until it's almost upright, which means that basically the whole tire during the roll phase, when all the weight's been put on it, is trying to make contact with the ground. Yeah? So that means that the temperatures, rather than being low, middle, high, they'll all be sort of high, high, high. And that means they're all getting good. You're getting good use out of the tire. That makes sense. Whoever it was, who was it? You said they didn't understand it. Johan.
Yeah, me, Johan.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So, but are you looking at all four tires individually? So you look only at the outside tire then, I guess.
I'll show you on the data.
And do you always run, like for F3, do you always run the same camber side to side?
You mean symmetrically, left and right?
Yeah.
You would do, yeah. I mean, you don't in ovals. You can use asymmetrical setups in ovals, and that's absolutely fine. But what you find is you've got where you're, say, like most of the, like in Lime Rock, for example, nearly all of the corners are right-hand turns. So it's almost like an oval. So you might think, I can set up the car like an oval. But you'll find that because it's not actually an oval and it hasn't got standard camber all the way around, and you are occasionally turning left as well as right, it actually makes the car really unstable. When you transition
The leader
from
has
going
just done
left
a
to going right, the car becomes
153.08.
unstable. And although you might think it's more beneficial to have, less camber on the inside tire, it actually turns out you end up losing time because the car becomes unstable. But anyway, we're off the topic. So whenever I'm looking at graphs, I'm looking for conspicuous anomalies. And whenever you're looking at any telemetry, what you want to do is change the setup of the car based on what I would call like the worst offender in the entire graph. In this particular graph, I can see a worst offender, or more or less a worst offender, about here, where I can see that the left front middle temperature is the highest out of them all, and that is wrong. What you essentially want is something that looks more or less like this, like the rear tire looks here, where the inside tire is inside temperature is the hottest, the middle temperature is either on it or slightly below it, and then the outside temperature is, there's a gap down to the outside temperature. This one also looks kind of okay. This one here isn't okay because the outer temperature is all bunched up with all of them. You can see this one here as well. The middle temperature is higher, and all of these things basically point to the fact that the cambers are not set up correctly. For example, here where they're all bunched up on the front left, what you want to try and achieve when you change the car is to lower the outside temperature. So if you imagine the outside of the wheel needs to be higher off the ground than the inside, which means you need to increase the camber, so increase how much the tire is leaned in towards the car. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yep.
Yep.
If
That's
we
good.
look at if you all go back into iRacing and look up the setup that we were just using, and you look at the cambers. I suppose that there'll be. Would it be helpful if I described some of them? I think I'm going to share my screen of iRacing. Sorry, I'm being a bit skittish. It's just that I've never really taught this to many people before. Hang on a sec. iRacing screen.
Yep.
So basically, all of those anomalies, or most of those anomalies that we had, are all because the camber is just too low on this high downforce default setup. The setup actually is really weird, but mostly it's because the camber is too small. Can you see my can you see the arrow?
No.
Oh, that's awkward.
Yeah, I can't see the cursor.
Can you see the
yeah.
cursor
Yeah,
now?
now we can.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, okay,
yeah.
because I had to go full screen. You may know that on most F3 setups, the camber is quite extreme, as in the number is really high, the minus number, which means it's leaning inwards towards the car. This is on minus 2.4, and I can't remember at any time ever running a camber that was so low as 2.4. You'll see if you just carry on clicking this, it goes up to 4. Can anyone remember the sort of numbers that any of my setups generally would have on the front? Anyone seen that?
I don't
High
remember.
threes.
No, I've actually most of the time got like 5, -5.
Oh
Oh
wow.
wow.
I'm not sure what it was in Watkins Glen. I think just because the tires were getting quite hot, I put it down to like -4, but still it's much higher than the 2.4 that it is on here. And essentially with that, the temperature graph, when it starts to sort of equalize, it's difficult to really see on the ones that we just did because this setup is so shockingly crap. But once you start adjusting the cambers towards something that is more reasonable, then when you go out and warm up the tires, the graph starts to make more sense. But again, you'd sort of make some more temperature data, and then you would look back at the temperature graph and just look for anomalies that make you think, hang on, I know the inner supposed to be hottest, the middle supposed to be slightly less hot, and then the outer supposed to be coolest. And you can look for the anomaly in your tire data and then change the cambers based on what you see. And it doesn't actually matter if you change it too much. Personally, what I would do if I'm wanting to alter this setup is that I would just chuck all of the cambers up to absolute maximum, which on the front here is 3.9, on the back is 4.4. Actually, it's not 4.4. Once you press OK, it's going to go down, yeah, -3.8. I presume maybe there's a few people here who are not that familiar with all of these settings or don't really bother staring at this too much. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just drive a setup. I don't even look at it.
I just do
Right,
like
okay.
spring. I'll just change like spring rates and make it a little bit softer, but just the basics.
Okay, right. That's good to know. Okay. Yeah, hang on. Let me just think about how I would explain this. Let me just go through a few things that I would do when, because there's loads of stuff on this setup, which I would say is just weird and is never going to make the car fast, just based on my experience. So rather than like going from high downforce and incrementally sort of changing a few things, I would now make some radical changes. The most radical change, of course, is putting the fuel level down to something that is much more appropriate. I don't know what it's going to be, to be honest. It's what, 20, is it 25 laps? I don't even know. But it's going to be somewhere around 30 probably. So I'd put the fuel down to 30. I don't know if any of you run like race labs or whatever, but I run race labs, so I can tell what my fuel economy is or whatever, see how much fuel I'm using per lap, and then I just use a calculator based on the PDF of telling us how many laps they were going to be in the race, and just do a quick calculation of roughly how much fuel we're going to need for the race, because that would be important for just generally the feel of the setup. There's a lot of people who make setups on like low fuel, and I always think that's a terrible idea. Whenever I'm making setups, I always start it on full fuel, because in a lot of ways you can make like little modifications based on how it feels on low fuel later on. The most important thing is like the beginning of the race and the initial laps. Like the first half of the race, I think is much more important than the latter half of the race. In a lot of ways, you need a really good balanced car so that you can, be properly good at the beginning. What you guys may or may not know. Let me just go through a few of these things. The front and the back ride height. So here it's telling me that the front ride height is 13.7. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to just high downforce set. Okay. So this has the front ride height at 15.5 or whatever. The rear ride height at 47, which I personally think is just bloody absurd. I've never seen such an absurd rake angle on an F3 car. So I don't know why they make this high downforce setup like that, but they do. So we'll just have to roll with it. Everyone gets rake angle? Or, sorry, I should say, is there anybody who doesn't understand rake angle?
Good.
No. So you all understand it? That's good. Do that again. Anyone not understand rake angle? You all get it?
I'm good. Yeah, I got it.
Yeah. Okay. That's all good. All good. So, I personally, you may have noticed that a lot of my setups are quite stable compared to like VRS. VRS generally would have quite a high rake. It would probably have 15.1 at the front or very low at the front, because this only goes down to like 15 and then it says too low and it doesn't pass the check. And at the back, Julian would generally have 38, 30, 37, something like that. Whereas I would generally have 25, 25.5. I basically put the rear ride height as low as I possibly can. So there's only a small difference between the front and the back, really lowering the rake angle, because I find that, well, as you may know, the ground effect, the downforce created by the ground effect is a lot more draggy than the downforce you can get from using wings. So I personally have always found that it's much quicker to just minimize the ground effect as much as possible and just use extra wings if need be. I've just generally found that is better, and that's the philosophy that I use, because also making the back lower helps to stabilize the car. That thing that happens with VRS when you brake or you turn in too quickly and the rear end just goes for it and there's nothing you can do about it. That's mostly caused because of the center of mass being so far forward, or the center of gravity or whatever being so far forward because of this rake angle. So I generally move the center of mass backwards to stabilize the rear of the car. I just personally like it better that way. because you can kind of chuck it in better. Now the way that you change the front ride height is by using the pushrod length offset on the front. So you've got like different settings here. You've got things that adjust for the rear, things that adjust for the front, and then you've got individual settings for the 4 tires. So if I push the push rod around here, you can see it's changed now to 14, 14.5, 15.5, and you can move this up to like extreme levels like 30 on the front. But it's generally good to have like the front fairly low. And
Do
the
you
sets.
usually run the car low, Sam, or?
Well, it depends really. It depends. Like I was making a setup for Donington, and I've ended up having 19.1 at the front. Just so I raised the whole car about 4 mil, just because it was hitting the ground a little bit, and it just seemed to be better over the curbs. So it depends. If you're on a track that doesn't have many curbs, but it depends on the data really. I feel like I'm like rambling on that. I need to like move this forward quicker, I think. So you've got to. Somebody mentioned like changing the springs. Like on the back, your springs are called spring rate, and it's currently 123 newtons per millimeter, which means for every 123 newtons being pressed down onto the springs, it will move down 1 millimeter. So if this number goes up to like 200 newtons per millimeter, it means I can put 200 newtons of pressure onto the suspension and it only move a millimeter. So upwards stiffens the suspension and downwards softens the suspension. This is the rear suspension is already on minimum, and you can see that the ride height is 47.1. Now, if I'm thinking, I think stiffer suspension at the back will be better for the feel of the car, and I go click, click, 1 click each, press apply, and then I go out and test that, I've done something terribly wrong. In that what I've done is I've not only stiffened the rear suspension, but I've also changed the ride height, because the weight of the car is what is creating these newtons of force being pushed down. The weight of the car is pushing down the suspension. It moves 1 millimeter for every 131 newtons of pressure coming from the weight of the car. So by stiffening it, the car now can't press the suspension down so much. It's moved up to 48.7. So that's increased the rake angle. It's slightly increased the overall downforce. It has slightly moved the center of mass forwards because you've created more rake angle. So you're like leaning the car forwards. And that leaning of the car forwards and the moving of the center of mass is going to change the effect and the feel of the car much more than just changing the rear springs. So if I put this back to 2323, I have to remember that my ride height, my rake basically, my ride height at the back is 47.1. So if I really want to find out if 1 click of suspension at the back is better, I press apply and then I go to my push rods and I'll move that down until it's back at more or less 47.1. That basically has now equalized the changes that have happened because of the suspension, and I've isolated just that suspension change. Exactly the same happens at the front. The springs at the front are called torsion bar OD. I actually have no idea what the OD stands for, but it doesn't matter really. And these are also on minimum 12.15.
Outside diameter.
Okay, outside. Okay, thank you very much. So the same thing happens if I put this up and I click apply. The ride height has now gone up 2 millimeters. So that's pushed the center of mass backwards. That has started to ruin the ground effect that I had. So you're going to have slightly less front end. And you're never going to be able to assess whether it's that. So I would go to I'd have to remember what it was. Sometimes if I'm doing this, I actually just take a picture with my phone or something, just so that I can remember what they are. I can just refer to it if I've screwed anything up. So I know it's 15.5, so I click that, press apply, go up to push rod length, and I will lower that back to more or less 15.3. There is a finer adjustment here. The perch offset is a finer adjustment. Oh, I've just realized that this setup doesn't use a heave spring. I'm wondering whether moving on to what the fuck this heave spring is too complicated at this point, or whether I should talk about something else. Should probably talk about something else. We'll get into heave springs in a minute. Anyone have any questions so far?
When I was doing this, I noticed when I was playing with camber, it moved caster around quite a bit. Should I be worried about that?
Well, that's exactly the same. That's why I take a picture with my phone. So if you're going to move anything, you'll find that all sorts of weird crap happen. Okay, so if I change the camber here, 3 clicks, it has now changed the ride height, the caster, and the toe-in. And the toe-in can be particularly annoying when you're trying to adjust it back. It kind of flops about, but I can see on this one that it was supposed to be 1.1 or whatever, so I'll try and put that back, and I'll put this back to whatever it was supposed to be. And you'll see now I've changed the caster back. It's popped back up, so I'll try and put it on 15.7. And now let's change the camber, so I've got to put that on 2.7, and I'll click OK. And that's the caster has gone back to 5. This is the sort of crap that just happens constantly that you have to be really aware of until you sort of balance it out, which I'm sort of doing there. In fact, the camber's gone back to 2.5 or whatever. But yes, you'll also notice this. Look, if I say I want to put the cambers up because I think I need more camber, and I click apply, it can actually only go to 3.9. And I'm going, I want more camber. I've seen a setup where I've got like 5.4. And why can I only get 3.9? It's because of the geometry of the suspension, particularly at this point, the ride height and the caster. I normally have my casters at absolute minimum, which is like 13.1 or something. That's generally because at minimum, you get most play with your maximum cambers. So you can see, look, I've put the caster down to 13, and already the camber can go up to 5.3. You'll notice as well that if I take the push rod and I put this ride height up to something insane, just put it to maximum, it will go, which is at the moment 29.9 or 30. I can now put my camber up to 5.8, which is extreme camber of the type you will never, ever, ever, ever need. If you put your ride height at 29.9, it's going to feel like a shopping trolley, and you're never really going to be able to steer it anyway. So it doesn't really matter even if you put your camber up at 5.8. It's not going to make any difference to your turn-in. There's other problems with the car that you need to worry about more. So yeah, there's weird things like that where, based on the geometry of the suspension, the camber will either go up really high or it won't. It's the same on the back. So if I put this camber up to maximum, it only wants to go to 3.9, 3.8. But if I take the push rod and I work that up a bit, it should... Oh no, it's because now the toe-in is going crazy. The rear toe-in is actually really, really annoying. For some reason, the right rear toe-in... See, I've put it to 0. I'm going to press apply. It's gone up to -3. I'm going to put it back down. It's gone to -1. Actually, I still can't infect the camber. What am I doing wrong here? I'm doing something wrong. Actually, I can't even work out what I've done now. Oh, maybe it's because it's too high. Sorry, on the rear, it's actually the opposite way around. So the camber will go up as the ride height goes down. You can actually see it moving there. I put the ride height down to something stupid, which it won't even have. You can see now I can now put the rear camber up to 5.7. And that's basically just the geometry of the suspension. So that's another trick for having a low rear ride height as I normally would have it on, 20, just over 25. The minimum is 25. So I'd sort of put it on 25.5. And that allows me to have minus 4.4 camber if I need to, which at some tracks actually is really beneficial to have more camber on the rear. Okay. Let's talk about heave springs quickly. The heave spring is a really weird, has a really weird effect on F3 in real life. I mean, is there anyone who doesn't understand what a heave spring is? I've already asked that, I think. Have I? No, I haven't.
I don't know what it is.
Okay.
No idea.
Okay. So the suspension on each wheel is for each individual wheel, and it's right. It's like near the tire, and it operates the wheels independently. Whereas the heave spring is basically in the middle of the car, and it's a spring that just operates the up and down motion of both of the front, or basically the whole front of the car. So the heave spring just operates the front. The front heave spring does the front of the car up and down only, whereas obviously with the wheels, when you compress the right side spring, the whole car leans over to the right. So there's sort of slightly different effects of adjusting the heave spring versus the individual wheel springs. But it's the heave spring essentially, as you'll know, when you're going into a corner, when you apply the brakes, the front of the car dips down with the change in center of gravity or whatever. And that's what enables you to either go into the corner properly or understeer or oversteer or whatever. And you can make modifications to your individual springs on your wheels to affect that, but it's much, much more simple to use the heave spring, which is just, is only up and down on the front, and the heave spring at the back is just up and down on the back, not like rolling or anything. And
so Sam, is that just a like a control of weight transfer from rear to front? Is that the best way to look at that?
yeah, that's exactly the way to look at it. Yeah, it basically just controls the way it controls the transient movement of the car in the braking phase and in the acceleration phase, and sort of in the phase in between as it transits from one to another. But I mean, modifications to the heave spring and the things that it affects, the front heave spring basically is if you, well, what I'm trying to say is I'm got these things in my head thinking I need to talk about like shocks and dampers and shit. I'm trying to make sure that I sort of structure this properly and I'm not going to start confusing people. But
Sam,
yeah.
So basically on the acceleration point, let's say we're coming off the corner, we're getting some wheel spin. Could we use the heave spring to kind of dampen some of the load transition to the rear to soften some of that sudden movement of weight to the back?
No. Well, technically yes, but I personally wouldn't. I would use the shocks, the rear shocks, to do that, which are to do with the heave spring. What I would never do is what I'm trying to get around to saying is what I never ever do, and I've never seen anyone really do it, is have the heave spring change the strength of the heave spring to affect the handling of the car. I've given it a go in the past, and it does have an effect, but I never ever use it, and I've never seen anyone else ever use it. For some reason, like in this default setup, they have both heave springs switched off, which means a lot of things have no effect whatsoever. Like watch the heave perch offset affect the ride height. It's not affecting the ride height at all, because at 0, there is no heave spring. And I might think, if you ever look at a VRS setup, they have the shocks generally at like 110 or something. The compression and rebound at 210, because that helps you to turn into the corner quickly and keeps the rebound damping, keeps the front end down to give you more grip going through the middle and the exit of the corner. But if you've got heave spring to 0, these shocks do absolutely nothing at all. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. So what I always have, and what I think every professional setup manufacturer does, is you want a front heave spring, but you don't really want it to do anything. So you just have it on minimum, which is 60. So I think you'll find if you look at any setup nowadays, the front is just always on 60 because that at least activates the shocks on the front. I can now use perch offset. Look at the ride height down here. Perch offset is now affecting the ride height because there is actually a spring in there. And that sort of thing. And the bump rubbers and all of these things will all now actually have a proper effect because I've got a heave spring there. What I was doing last season is also doing the same with the back, is that I would have it on 150, which is the minimum you could possibly have it, just so then I can muck around with the shocks to affect the handling of the car. You do have shocks on the rear wheels, and on the front wheels you've got shocks which affect the handling of the car, but this is an extra spring where you can then have another set of shocks to handle to affect the car even more. So yeah, the heave spring, you've got to decide whether you want it or not. This season, actually, the heave spring at the back, it seems like it was a couple of seasons ago, it's actually much quicker just to have it switched off altogether. Which again, I could talk about further, but I'm concerned about getting it too complicated.
Sorry, Sam, just one question. But
Yeah.
that's still only controlling the forward and back motion, not anything side to side. Those extra options for like the third
Yes.
compression types. Okay.
Yeah.
Does it mean that if you switch it off, it's just sort of like a solid?
No, it's as if basically you have these on 0. So
Okay.
it's they would be as soft, so soft, it's like they don't exist, because they actually just don't exist when you have it on 0.
But
They have no effect whatsoever.
I mean, it makes the car move even more, or just not
Makes
move
the
at all?
car move even more. Yeah.
Oh.
There's like ultimate softness on the thing, which is good and bad. I mean, the reason you want shocks is because you want to control how much the car moves. You know, it's like you might think it's a good thing if it's as soft as it can go, because you think, well, the front end will dip really, really quick and I'll get lots of turn in. But then what happens is as soon as you get on the power, it also just the front end just comes straight back up again with no resistance whatsoever. And suddenly, yeah, the car might turn in pretty well, but it's not going to turn out very well. You're going to like get oversteer into the corner and understeer out the corner.
So sorry to interrupt. Another question. Does that, so let's say you have the heave dampings at like 1 and 10, and you've got the heave spring at whatever 60, the lowest. Now, when you increase the heave spring, does it also exponentially or increasingly increase the damping and as well?
Will it increase the damp? Yes, it will.
Okay.
Yeah, it will stop it from moving so much. Yeah.
Okay.
Just because you're stopping the movement of the entire system.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But it won't necessarily it won't really do it as you expect, because it'll. There's no point dampening the rebound of the front end coming back off the thing if it never got there in the first place. Does that make sense?
I think so.
So like you stiffen the front heave and you think, now the dampers will have more of an effect, but like the compression will never happen. So the rebound can't happen either, because the front end's never gone down because the heave was so.
Because it's too stiff. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're minimizing its effect then.
Yeah. Basically, if you put the heave spring up, the car just doesn't do anything at all. It feels like absolute crap.
Gotcha.
Which is why everyone just has it, just activates it by having it on minimum, but you never really see any setups unless you're like on some kind of crazy oval or something, maybe. But in like a normal like F3 circuit setup, if you're going to use them at all, you just activate them so that the shocks actually work, and you can use the heave perch offset and all of this kind of stuff. But you would never really have it higher. I mean, there's certain things. I don't know if you ever saw that throughout the whole of last season, just about every professional setup that anyone ever made,
Yeah, I
the
noticed.
rear toe was on minus 2.2, and the setup for Watkins Glen that Julian made for VRS, he's got like the rear toe in on minus 2.1, and you may or may not know that the rear toe in on a minus number kind of, and the fact that it works in a setup is sort of against the laws of physics, and it shows that iRacing is not properly simulating the rear tire traction or anything. It really shouldn't work at all. But for season after season after season, it really worked. It's sort of like an exploit, basically, that people found and everybody adopted it because it somehow just gave you loads of rear grip. But it shouldn't do. In real life, it would not do that. It would just destroy the tires and cause like weird flat slides and all sorts of horrible things would happen.
But
That
when you have it on a minus number, does that make the tire point inwards towards the car, right? Or am I wrong?
So toe in at the front makes the very front of the tires closer together.
Yeah.
So the front of the front tires are close together with front toe in. The back of the back tires are close together with positive toe in.
Yeah.
So toe out at the back, which is negative toe in, means the back of the back tires are further apart.
Yeah. Usually you want it the other way around, right?
Yeah, it has a stabilization effect for sure. It would stabilize the car because the wheels are therefore basically rolling towards each other, which means that the car will stabilize. But if you can imagine in your head what the left rear tire is doing when you go through a right turn, and what the right rear tire is doing when you go for a right turn, you realize that it doesn't work. It's like the car, you're trying to push, like when you go through, like, say, the carousel at Watkins Glen, long, fast right hander, and you've got negative toe in on your left rear left. It's the tire is sliding sideways,
Yeah.
which is terrible. Like, it would overheat the tires. It would undermine any grip that you had whatsoever, because the tire is constantly, it's like an insane slip angle. It just really shouldn't work. And I think they fixed it, even though VRS is still using like minus 2.1. I had a look at what's his name set, Suelio Almeida's Watkins Glen set, and he is still using minus negative toe in at the back. But in all of my experiments, I have found that it does not work. And in my Watkins Glen setup, I mean, the natural thing to do with the rear toe is to have it at like plus 0.2 or 0.5 or something along those lines, because the rear camber, as you can probably imagine, if you imagine a tire freewheeling on its own, not attached to a car, like rolling along the ground, if it's leaning over to the left, like the rear right tire is with negative camber, it's leaning over to the left side, it would turn left, if you get that, just like a bicycle tire. So to counteract the turning left, if you put a little bit of positive toe in, the tire is then trying to steer in the other direction as well, which basically reduces the friction that it has on the road. So you're basically, by putting a little bit of positive toe in, you're counteracting the tire friction that's happening from the camber, and this would make the tire have less friction, more ground contact, less slippage, basically. So it's in contact with the ground more often and with more material.
You're basically aligning the tire with the path of the car that's taking while turning.
yeah, so the camber is trying to turn the tire left.
Mm-hmm.
So that creates resistance on the car. The toe-in, the positive toe-in, would be trying to turn the tire right. So they cancel each other out, meaning the tire is happy going in a straight line. And that means that it will give you better straight line speed because you've got less resistance with the road, if that makes sense.
Definitely does. Thank you.
This
that
stream,
does
whoever's
make
recording
sense.
this stream is going to put people to sleep, I think.
I'm recording.
Me too. But we actually got one more guy in here because of that.
Oh, well.
That's good.
Okay. How far are we into the session?
1
We
hour.
don't know, an hour. Okay. All right. This is the problem with me. It's like droning on and on and on about all of this shit.
Trust me, I know.
Hey Sam, I do have a question on the. I'm sure you may get into this. I don't know. Are you headed to the compression and rebound dampening?
I mean, I can if you want. Shall I explain dampers, or is that getting too complicated? I don't know.
Well, I think by dampening, you're just talking about the speed of transfer of weight, correct?
Well, it's. I mean, you could look at it that way, but it's basically just the change in ride height.
So would that mean on the compression dampening and rebound dampening, they have opposite effects front and rear? So in other words, if one is changing the handling going into a corner, it's going to basically be the opposite coming off the corner, or is that inaccurate?
You mean in terms of compression or rebound?
Correct.
Yeah. So if you dampen the compression on the in going into a corner, it will produce understeer. On the front, sorry. If you dampen the compression on the front, it will create understeer going into a corner. If you dampen the compression on the rear, it won't do anything on the entrance to the corner because the rear is going up. It compresses when it's coming back down. It will give you, if you dampen the compression of the rear, it will create understeer going into the mid corner. See, this stuff is overly complicated, which is why I'm not sure if people really want me to start explaining it. If they're not sleepy enough already from hearing me droning on.
Well, this area in the corner is kind of where I want to make my adjustments. I can kind of settle the car in a lot of spaces, but really changing the dynamics of the car as it transitions into the corner and rotates on mid, and then how it grips coming off are the exact things that I think most of us are trying to kind of adjust to match.
Yeah. Is there anyone here who doesn't understand dampers at all and doesn't know what the hell we're going on about?
I've got a basic understanding of it.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, me too.
So you kind of understand what compression dampening is doing.
Yeah, when you hit the brakes, the front end goes down. Is that the dampening you're talking about?
No, the dampening is a force slowing down the front end going down. If you oh god,
it controls the rate at which the spring compresses.
That's why it's called dampening. Yeah.
Okay.
So say you stamp on the brakes, and the front end goes like almost immediately to its lowest ride height. That would create a lot of turn in. If it's creating too much turn in when you stamp on the brakes, and you're like, I want to brake late, but I don't want like the front to have that much grip, then you would dampen the compression of the front end, which means give a resistance to how quickly that front ride height can go downwards.
Gotcha.
And because it takes longer to go down, the weight doesn't immediately transfer to the front, which then reduces how much oversteer you're having. And similarly with like the rear end, if you imagine what happens when you come out of a corner, as you brake into the corner, the front end is going down, the back end is coming up, right?
Yeah.
When you're coming out of a corner, the front end is going up and the back end is coming down. So if you're suffering understeer when you're coming out of the corner, you can either dampen the rebound of the front, so slow down how quickly the front comes back up to try and keep it low down on the front, or you can dampen the compression of the rear So the rear comes up when you brake,
Yeah.
and that gives you more front end. But as you get on the accelerator, the rear wants to come back down, which moves the weight, transfers the weight backwards, which essentially gives you understeer on the way out of the corner. So that might actually be a positive thing if you're thinking, I'm coming out of the corner and I'm losing the back end. How on earth can I stop the back end from coming round when I'm going out of the corner? Well, you soften the dampening on the rear compression. You therefore allow the weight to transfer to the back. Therefore, the weight goes onto the back wheels quicker, giving you more grip on your back wheels. But if you were getting understeer coming out of a corner, you would stiffen the dampers on the compression of the back so that it stayed the rear ride height stayed higher for longer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, then that keeps the front end more planted on the exit so you can get the better exit, better traction.
Yeah. Like when you're coming to thinking about dampers and what to do with dampers, you really have to just stop for a bit and take a deep breath and really think through what it is that you want to achieve. I mean, there are like graphs and stuff you can look at. You look at the histograms, which sort of give you a better idea of what's actually happening, so you can kind of see what you need to adjust. Like certainly, if you're going around and you're thinking, oh, the car kind of feels all right, but it feels sort of like weirdly unbalanced. I'm not really happy with it. And you look at like a damper histogram, that shows you visually the tiny little changes you can make that you can't necessarily put your finger on. It would say, oh, I just need, it's just a little bit of here that is a little bit too, this is a little bit too stiff, or this is a little bit too soft. So I can change that by one click here and one click here. And then suddenly you drive the car and it feels a lot more balanced. But also, there are big changes that you can make using the dampers that solve the things that you're trying to solve. So, you're trying to make a setup and you're going around and you think like, oh, Suzuka at a certain corner, like the fast right-hander into another right-hander. I can't remember what it's called. It's got a weird name. I can't remember.
I know.
Degna 1.
Yeah,
Degna
1 and Degna 2.
Yeah.
So you might think, I'm just getting so much understeer into Degna 1. I just can't get the car into Degna 1. That is a kind of problem that you can solve by really thinking about what the dampers might be doing at that particular moment.
Right.
And or you might be getting oversteer into Degna 1, and you can then make conscious changes. In which case, the graph histogram doesn't really matter. The histogram is there so that you can look at it and look for obvious anomalies when you're actually first creating your setup. But then when you've made your setup and you're more or less happy with the balance, but there's a few corners where you think, I would be so much faster if I had a little bit more front end there, or if the back end was just a little bit more stable, I could get on the accelerator early. That's when you can make like conscious decisions about affecting the dampers.
Do you mind showing us the data for the dampers that you might look at?
Yeah, sure.
Well, and while you do that, Sam, on those two particular corners that you're talking about, so when you go into the first one, obviously you're carrying a little bit more speed into that one than you are the second. How much does the speed and amount of down, reduction in speed and such really affect from the cambers or the compression and rebound standpoint, if that makes sense? I kind of jumbled that up.
It doesn't really make sense. Say again.
So like when you go into the first corner, you're at high speed, high downforce, and you're basically kind of setting the car, if anything, with the brakes or positioning. And then when you go into the second corner, maybe it's a little more aggressive of a braking in a turn. So it's going to handle different going into that first corner versus the second one. So when I get in the second one, I mean, how much do I really pay attention to the differences as I enter the corner and the compression that is applied?
Well, at that point, I mean, just like everything, it's always going to be a compromise. You can't set the car up. This is why, like in things like Formula One, they always wanted like computer-controlled, automatic, adjustable things that adjust automatically as you go from corner to corner. Without those automatic adjustments, you've got to just make a decision about what is best in general for one or the other, or for both, or whatever. And maybe if it doesn't work that way, you've got to adjust your driving style to it. You know?
Gotcha. Yep.
You're not necessarily going to be able to set up things like the dampers ideally for every single corner on the track. You've got to basically sit down and think really hard. You think, well, which corners do you actually like get more time out of compared to others? You know? And I do that a lot actually when I'm thinking about like maybe just like the sort of general philosophy of how I might set up the car for a certain track. I sort of sit back and I think, well, which corners are like really, really important and which corners aren't very important. And I'll try and set up the car to be fast around the corners where I make up the most time. If you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's the thing I run into a lot of times is I'm adjusting my driving style to match what the setup's giving me. And kind of the where I'm trying to get with this is, this is an opportunity to figure out how I can adjust the setup to match what I'm looking for as far as turn goes.
Yeah. And this is the benefit of learning how to set up the car yourself. I can tell you that I learned, although like years and years and years ago when I used to play things like GTR when I first had a wheel, like fucking years ago, I can remember mucking around with the cambers and becoming familiar with like some of the settings for the cars and really being interested in it. But then I just like didn't play a motor racing simulator for like 15 years or something. And I knew that I sort of had the right kind of brain to do setups and stuff, but I wasn't too familiar with how to do it. And it was only when I was in a team with Greg Seitz that I started to sort of get into like, I'd try and make setups and then he would provide a setup for us for a particular race and I'd drive his and go, oh my God, this is so much quicker than mine. How the hell does he do it? And he never really explained it to me. He sort of didn't really want to explain it to me. He was sort of keeping his cards close to his chest. I think he was worried that I would end up being able to beat him. So he just he wouldn't really say anything. So I just had to sort of like look at what he was doing and kind of just scratch my head and go like, what the hell? But you'll find that I generally found that using his setup against him, I could never beat him. It's only since I've left that team and I've been forced in a position where I have to make my own setups if I actually want to be competitive, that now I can make setups actually for myself and on occasion I can beat him. So it doesn't matter, like, I mean, people keep saying to me, aren't you worried, if you make setups and share everyone on IGP that everyone will start beating you with your own setup? And I'm just like, well, no, not really, because the setups are my setups. I make my tiny minor balance adjustments to perfect it for where I want to turn in and where I want to brake. The only way to really be much quicker is to make adjustments to your own setups,
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm looking for.
Hey,
Okay.
Sam, quick question for you. How long does it take you to make your setup?
It depends, really. Some of them are really quick. Some of them take bloody ages. It just depends. Often I will base a setup on a setup that I've already done, based on like what kind of track it is. And so I've got a good starting point, so that saves a lot of time. And it's also about blind luck as well. Like, although it's basically like you've got to really think about, whether or not a car needs a higher ride height because of the bumps, or whether you can get a lower ride height because it's more smooth. And you can make an educated guess about whether or not the cambers really do need to be higher or lower, and whether the tires are going to last, and therefore you have to sort of bring the cambers down a little bit. And as long as you've done all that stuff in your head, sometimes you can just sort of fluke going in the correct direction with your setup. But there are some times where you start going in the wrong direction to set up and try and solve things, and you end up making the car slower and all that kind of shit. That can easily happen. So a lot of it's to do with blind luck, really. Not sure if that answered the question.
Yep.
So this is the damper histograms, and just by looking at this, I can tell that this car is crap. The downforce, the setup is really crap. Blind rule of thumb of these is that well, let me just explain exactly what this is. Everyone can see my cursor, yeah?
Yep, I can see.
Yeah.
Okay, so can you see these percentages?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah,
So
you
this
got
is
30%.
the percentages of time of your over your entire lap. So this particular lap is 156, let's say 2 minutes. So 30% represents 30% of 2 minutes, which is whatever, do the math. I can't work it out. 30% of 2 minutes is 40 seconds, right? So down the bottom here, you have the speed of your suspension movement.
Yeah, I can't really.
Both, okay, it's both up and down. Let me see if I can zoom in.
Yeah, the finer text, the smaller text isn't coming in so great.
It's all like overlapping. Can you see that?
Sort of, yeah.
Just
Or
barely.
millimeters per second or something.
It's millimeters per second, yeah. So zero, the middle bar represents your suspension moving at 0 millimeters per second, meaning stationary. Right? Over here, on the left side of each of these graphs, because these are going like left front, left rear, right rear. Left front, it says lap 1. This is for a comparison, so they're the same because I'm not comparing a lap. But it's basically saying that rebound is on the left side and bump or compression is on the right side. So the compression is when the suspension is, or the body of the car is moving downwards towards the ground. So you can see here, this bar here represents 25 millimeters per second, and it's on the compression side. So that's your suspension moving at 25 millimeters per second downwards. This is 50 millimeters a second, 75 millimeters a second downwards. This is minus 25 millimeters a second, minus 50, which is going upwards. So you can tell because it's on the rebound.
Okay.
So it's when your suspension is going up. So I can tell that for whatever the hell this crazy number is, 35, 38% or something of the entire lap, my front left suspension is stationary. For 20% of the time, it's going whatever this happens to be, 12, I guess 12.5 millimeters per second downwards. And the whole idea about these graphs is to make them symmetrical, because you can imagine if my front suspension is going downwards for 20% of the time and going upwards for 23% of the time, then my ride height at certain parts is going to be higher than it should be because it's going upwards for longer than it's going downwards. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Yeah.
Like if my suspension was always going upwards and never going downwards, the car would take off. You know what I mean? Or rather, all it really means is that the ride height is not coming back to a predictable value each time you're going around the track. So you might go into like turn 4 or something, and your ride height would be 17 millimeters off the ground, and that would give you a certain amount of turn in. And then the next lap you come around, it might be 18 millimeters off the ground, and you've got less turn in. And you might think, well, why the hell were some laps I feel like I can turn in better, and other laps I feel like I can't turn in better? It's like the car is not predictable because it's not, the dampers are not balanced, and so the car isn't always returning to the same value at the same place every lap. So to solve that problem and make the car very predictable, you have to make sure that these values are symmetrical on both sides. So at 12 millimeters a second, these bars should be the same height. At 25 millimeters a second, these smaller bars, these should be the same height. And then wherever this one is, this next setting up, these should be the same height, or you're not going to end up with predictable behavior
So if
every lap.
if it goes up 12 millimeters, it's got to go back down 12 millimeters.
Yes.
Gotcha.
And you could just stare at these bars and go, oh, this one's slightly taller than that one, and this one's slightly taller than that one. Or you could just look at these values here, 48% and 44%. So that's an easier way to tell you that you've got 48% of the movement on rebound and only 44% on bump. So you need to change something to equalize these out. There's no easy way to explain what this, how to. It gets really complicated when you try to explain this, really. But you like this. Say this bar, the 48% rebound represented by this bar on the left. Say you wanted to make that shorter, you would need to loosen the suspension so that it can travel faster, because this bar represents low speed. The one in the middle represents absolutely stationary, which you could think about as the damper being very, 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 very stiff, because it's dampening all movement altogether. So the taller the bar represents more damping. So if you want to make this bar shorter, you have to soften the damper. If you want to make this bar taller, you've got to stiffen the damper.
And what's you're saying this range here, 48 to 44, that's alarming to you. So what is a good value to look for?
50-50. Well, these need to be the same. They're never going to be 50-50, but they just need to be equal.
Like,
so it doesn't matter if this is this is 46 and this is 46. That's good. If this is 44 and this is 44, that's good.
Okay.
But if this is 48 and that's 44, you've got an imbalance.
Okay. Gotcha.
So it's saying basically here that you could either make an adjustment to make the rebound softer, or you could make the compression stiffer. It's entirely up to you, depending on which direction you want to go.
Right. How fine of an adjustment do you get on that sound? Like, what do you try and?
Well, the only thing you can do is experiment with it, basically. If it's quite a lot, I would say that this is sort of quite a lot-ish. So maybe I'll go 2 clicks, but I might just go 1 click. But you've got to bear in mind that this, in a lot of ways, this graph doesn't really represent anything that you can really imagine in reality. It's a representation of the mathematics of the geometry of your suspension. So you can't really look at this graph and say, it looks cool, or it looks great, therefore it must be great. The only thing you can, there are all sorts of things that affect this, including when you make a damper change, you will actually have to drive the car, or you'll end up driving the car slightly differently, because it'll either turn in better or it will turn in worse, or different part of the track it might, again, like turn in better or turn in worse, or have less traction or have more traction. And that will have an effect on what this graph looks like as well. So the only thing you can really do is make an adjustment, go out and do a few laps, come back and look at the graph again.
And is that a symmetrical adjustment, or?
Yes, as in if you make the rebound, say, softer on the front left. If you look at this graph and you think, yeah, the front rebound on the left is too high, you would make a symmetrical adjustment for both fronts. Also, a thing to bear in mind is that the bar in the middle, for some tracks that will be taller, for other tracks that will be shorter. And the reason for that is because in some tracks, that central bar means the suspension is not moving. Yeah, it represents how much of the lap the suspension is not going up or down on the front left. If you've got a track that is beautifully smooth and has massive long straights, then that central bar will be much taller, like it is here, 38%. On a lot of other tracks that don't have so many long straight lines as Suzuka, it might be 25%. There are some tracks where the car is basically never on a straight, you're always like either turning left or turning right or going up or down a hill, or some kind of transient change is always happening. In which case, this central bar might be really, really short because the front ride height is never stationary. Does that make sense?
Yep, that does. Yeah.
Sam, is there a different? Do you have different settings for high and low on these suspensions, or is it just
No,
one?
in F3 it's just one, yeah.
Okay.
Which is actually quite awkward. It means it's less easy to balance them out sometimes. But then
Yeah.
this graph is only for spotting anomalies. If the car feels fantastic and you're really fast, it doesn't really matter what that graph looks like at all, as I have found out. Let me show you quickly.
It doesn't lead to any like additional tire wear or anything like that?
No, I don't think so. No, not in my experience anyway.
Okay. Okay.
This is just a guide, just like anything. Like I said at the very beginning, you're looking for anomalies that could be solved by something.
Gotcha.
Ride heights as well, though, is quite important in terms of the general speed of the car. This ride height graph. So, and each of these, you've got like a measurement for the left and the right front. Down here, you've got left and the rear, left and right rear. And because this is the default setup and it's not optimized in any way, you can see that it's not even getting close to grounding out. But because this graph goes 20 millimeters, 10 millimeters, the 0 millimeters, which represents the ground, isn't even on the graph because the suspension is going nowhere near the ground whatsoever, which actually means that this setup is not optimizing the traction available at all. Often when you go into a track, you will find that you've got massive anomalies where like the rear ride height is going into the minus millimeters. It's going like minus 10 millimeters into the ground, which obviously can't really happen in real life without the whole thing breaking. But in iRacing, it can. You can occasionally go, the car goes beneath the surface of the ground. And if that were to happen, say this spike here, we're at minus 10 millimeters rather than 4.2, whatever it is. And I think, wow, the car is hitting the ground really hard there. I would leave this blue marker on that exact point. I would adjust this thing down here and I'd go like that. So it's on the exact point. I would then look up at the speed graph and see if there's a dip in the speed. So I would be able to check if that grounding out is actually affecting my speed or whether or not it doesn't matter. I can tell you that the big mistake that Suelio Almeida made with his Watkins Glen setup is that the car hits the ground a lot and he was using no rear heave spring at all. So there was no suspension resistance on the back stopping the car from bouncing about as it goes over bumps. And that made the car hit the ground a lot. And his solution to that, since he didn't want to put a heave spring in the back, was raise the rear ride height massively high. And this sort of spoilt his overall grip level. But what I found, as I did like extensive experiments with raising the ride height so I could keep soft springs with I wanted to keep the soft springs, but I didn't want the car to hit. So I was experimenting with raising the ride height massively, and I found that it just made the car feel really crap and it wasn't really sticking to the fast turns. And I found that it was actually much quicker just to let the car hit the ground and then get the benefit of the lower ride height around the fast corners. But he tried to fix that by making this massively high ride height, which affected his overall speed, which is good. Huh?
Are you worried about for damage or anything with that? Like how would you how would this graph show you damage, if at all, if it could?
It wouldn't. Okay. Really. And I'm not really sure if the car really does get damaged by hitting the ground. I mean, sometimes you can damage the suspension by thing. I've never found it. Maybe Chris has.
You used to be able to. I remember Suzuka last season had 20 seconds of repairs in a league race.
Yeah, from like floor damage.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, but that was surely suspension damage from going like riding the curb and deck one, no?
You can have a look at my lap. Look at my lap 6 now in the session, and I did the exact same line I used to run. But from the replay, it looks like it's the floor that goes through the ground.
In F3.
Yeah. I'm in.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
in hosted.
Yeah, that's a good thing to point out as well. Is that there's another thing you can do if you're looking at the ride heights and you're thinking like, say this was 0 rather than 10, and you might look at this part of the lap and think, is the car actually embedding itself into the ground? Let's have a look. What I would do is I would look at this particular part of the course. I'd work out which corner this was, and then to find out exactly where I was in the replay. I know there are other things you can do in VRS to do this as well, but I would basically look at the speed that I'm currently carrying, which is 214, and by that way I could locate that particular part of the replay of the car. And then if you go into like chase camera and you adjust the angle so that the camera is underneath the ground, you can see whether the car is actually going through the ground, because you'll see it sticking through the surface of the road. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does.
I occasionally do stuff like that, yeah. Or sometimes I'll just go into chase cam, put the camera under the ground, watch the lap in fast forward, and just look out for anomalies where maybe the car is sometimes the entire plank on the bottom suddenly appears through the road, and at that point you can kind of think, yeah, that's pretty bad, and you kind of locate where that is and have a look at it on the data and think, well, what can I do to stop that? Which actually takes us quite neatly, even though we've hardly done any driving in this session so far.
No, this has been great so far.
But Sam, you said you adjusted he was adjusting his ride height to fix that hitting the
ground.
And you just let it hit the ground. Couldn't you just increase the dampers without touching the springs?
Well, you could, but then that would change the transient handling through the corners.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you could increase the dampers overall, but it's not really an ideal solution. That's what I was going on to here, is actually the other ways you can fix grinding out, although it's not an amazing way to do it. In a lot of ways, the way Almeida did it, just by raising the ride height, is sort of the best way to do it. But let me go full screen. Can everyone see the cursor?
Yeah.
Yep.
So you have, where are they? Heave packers.
Yeah.
And what's the other one? Bump rubbers. And anyone not know what the hell those are?
Yeah, no idea.
Okay, so I almost feel I'm gonna get Microsoft Paint out. Hang on. Because it's definitely the easiest way to do it, to demonstrate what it is. Hang on. Can everyone see Microsoft Paint?
Yep.
Okay, so this is your suspension arm. This is your spring. I know this is really simplistic and dumb. This is where it's connected to the car. This is where it's connected to the wheel. So when the suspension compresses, obviously this part of it, let's say, comes down to here, and you've got the spring here. And you could say at this point, the wheel that's attached to the car is the ground. At this point, this is the bottom of the car, and this is the road. You can see it when the suspension compresses that much, the bottom of the car is hitting the road. So what you can do essentially is a packer basically is like a washer, which you put at the bottom of the suspension to basically stop your suspension from going down that far. So it can no longer compress It can still compress exactly the same, but essentially you're stopping it from going down that far. So this will now be 1 millimeter off the ground.
And
or you could put 2 millimeters of packers here, or 5 millimeters of packers here, or 10 millimeters of packers here, which would basically limit the suspension travel downwards.
does that change the damping at all?
It does, yeah, and it actually changes the deflations and the actual ultimate length of the suspension. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So it's not an ideal solution at all. I try not to use them really much at all. It's a crap solution because what it is, I think it's called like coil binding or whatever. What you end up doing is basically compressing the suspension springs so much that the whole thing is just like compressed into nothing, and it suddenly stops. So the car is traveling, the suspension travel is going downwards, and then suddenly it abruptly stops. And that the feeling of when that happens when you're in the middle of a corner is horrible, and it will probably make you crash. So in a lot of ways,
Gotcha.
the Packer is just like you don't really want to be using it. What was the other one called? Heave rubber, bump rubber is actually a little bit handier. A bump rubber sort of looks like a cone, like this sort of thing. So the suspension can compress it. So it's a piece of rubber that the suspension can compress, and because it's narrower at the top, it's
Yeah.
narrower here than it is down here. So the more the suspension tries to compress it, it can compress this bit really easily. But the further it tries to compress it, the more material it's having to compress, and the more difficult it becomes to compress it. So it's a way if you've got a suspension that is like really lively and it's sort of really like going down really fast. So you've got some of these bumps where the car is just going boom like that. What this will do is like slow down that thing. So instead of just going boom, it will go oh, and it just sort of smooths out some of like the really horrible bumps. And sometimes that can actually stop you from hitting the ground really hard and improves the speed. And you can have this at like 5 mil, 10 mil, 15 mil, 25 mil, and shit like that. So you can get to the point where you've got a heave rubber that is taking up a massive amount of your suspension travel, and all it does basically is smooths out what happens when the suspension gets towards like coil binding or gets towards having no travel left. And sometimes that is actually a really good solution to like hitting the ground a lot or bouncing around a lot, like pogoing and shit like that.
Gotcha.
Isn't
That's
that the
great.
sort of stuff you could do with a high and low comp usually if you had that?
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah.
I've got a question. Why does the F3 car has in total 6 springs with the front and the rear, and then you have for each wheel you have a spring? What's the purpose behind it? For the transition only, heave and front and
Well, by 6 you mean there's a spring for your 2 front wheels, and then you've got your heave spring in the middle, and then the same at the back. So 2 back wheels and then your heave spring. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, the front and the back heave spring only do the up and down motion of the car, where they don't deal with any roll or anything. So they have the 2 tires allow the car to go sideways. So it affects if you imagine you're looking at the back of the car here with the tires here or whatever, you've got the rolls side, this motion, the roll, which the heave spring does. If you look at the car, excuse the drawing, in this direction, the heave springs control this motion. Yeah.
All right.
The forward rock and roll of the car in that linear direction. Yeah.
Just sorry, just a question on that. Would you be able to simulate what the front and rear heave springs would do with just the 4 adjustments on each wheel?
Well, yeah, you just take the heave springs out, as we were talking about earlier on.
No, but I'm
You can
saying
just
like if you're saying like you can control the if it controls the forward and back motion, can you also not use the heave springs and then work that extra adjustments into each individual wheel?
well, yes, because they do that as well. I mean, the
Okay.
front the other four wheels, the four wheel adjustments, they have the same can operate and you can adjust them for the same motion as the heave spring, but you cannot separate that motion from this also what you could call like a sideways heave motion.
I see.
You can't separate the two, but certainly if you know stiffen the fronts, you slow it down, you
Right.
slow down the front pitching down, just like you would with it by using the heave spring.
So does it give you
Gotcha.
like a
But
finer level of control having softer springs then?
well, it's certainly does it give you finer level of control having softer springs?
Yeah, like you'd be able to run softer settings everywhere if you use the heave springs, right?
I don't know. I have tried stuff like that, and it feels terrible. It almost feels like you don't want to use the heat springs for anything. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I don't want to like come across as if I'm some kind of like complete expert in all of this. I'm really not. I mostly just have lots of experience with the F3. But yeah, I'm not sure. When I've experimented with it, I found that the tightening the heave spring has no benefit whatsoever. It really doesn't. You might have a benefit like trying to equal them out. So if you have a really aggressively stiff suspension setup on the wheels, you might find that you then have more of a benefit trying to equal that kind of stiffness with the heave spring. But in terms of having like a big disparity, but so it's having soft springs on the wheels and stiff on the heave spring, that starts to feel terrible.
So if I wanted to, let's say, settle the rear and it's not running a heave spring on the rear, adding one and then making some minor adjustments would help soften that.
Depends what you mean by control the rear or whatever you're saying. It
Like let
depends what your problem is.
like let's say on entry, like coming in on entry, you lose the rear end a little bit.
Well, putting more heave spring is going to make that problem a lot worse. Because let's not forget that the heave spring, even at the rear, even on minimum setting, is 150 newtons per millimeter.
Right. So
which is
you're
pretty
adding.
stiff already.
Gotcha.
Like if we go back to iRacing quickly.
But isn't it strange that you can't have a damper without the spring, though? I mean, the damper.
No, because I mean the damper essentially is a part of the spring, isn't it? It is a spring. It's just like a slightly different mechanism for springing the tire.
I thought the spring was just on the damper, and the damper was the oil thing that makes it go slower.
Yeah,
But yeah.
I don't believe that you. I mean, you can't. I don't think you can have a damper without a spring.
Okay.
Pretty sure, because there's no real want for it to try and stay stable. It would either stay in one position or another, I think. I'm not completely sure about that. Anyway, what I was pointing out was like the rear springs go down to 123. Can everyone see the screen?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the rear heave spring starts on 150.
Right.
And in my experience with the rears, is that super soft rear suspension is generally not a fantastic thing to have. It just doesn't. The car feels just way too soft and it's a bit rolly and all of that kind of shit. 158 is starting to get really quite stiff. I think on my Watkins Glen setup, I went up to 175, but that was mostly to try and limit the extreme grounding out that was happening on some of the corners. Just as a kind of solution to like not having to raise the ride height so much, because you sort of like limit how much the car can go up and down. But that's really quite extreme, 175 newtons per millimeter on the back. That's getting to really high.
Mhm.
So if you start like the next one up on the heave spring at the back is 170, this thing goes up to like 500.
Mm.
The only thing I would say about the heave spring, which I've sometimes done, is that you'll notice, I'm not sure if it happens with this particular setup, but you may know that as the fuel drains out during a race, that the rear ride height will go up and the front ride height will go up. So what a lot of people make the mistake in doing when they're making their own setups is that they'll make a setup that feels fantastic on like high fuel. And then as they go through the race, they'll go, I just keep losing the back end. I think I'm overheating the rear tires because the back end gets really, really out of control. But what's really happening is that they've got a stiff front suspension and a softer rear suspension, which means that as the fuel comes out, the rear ride height goes up much further than the front ride height changes with the weight difference. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
So what I always do when I've made a setup and I'm happy with it and I feel like the balance is fantastic, I start thinking about how this is going to change over the race. So what I do is I put in the race fuel, I write down the rear and the front and the back ride heights. I then take all of the fuel out and write down the front and the rear ride heights to see what the difference is. So if the front ride height is going up 0.5 millimeter and the rear ride height is going up 3 millimeters, then at the end of the race, the rake angle is much bigger than it is at the beginning of the race, which puts the center of mass forwards, which gives you oversteer. So what a lot of people think is them overheating the rear tires is in fact just the weight, the center of mass going forwards because the rake angle is changing. And that's actually something you can solve with putting a little bit of extra third spring in the back. Because if you've had this on 210 rather than 150, now instead of the rear ride height going up 3 millimeters when the fuel comes off, it might only go up 1.5 millimeters, which means that the balance stays more or less the same from high fuel to low fuel. Does that make sense? I'm never sure if I explain shit like that, if it actually makes any sense.
No, that does. That was great.
Yep.
You can also do weird things like, although it's more difficult, you can do things like, say, for example, your rear tires are actually going off through the race, as you can do by looking at the data and seeing what your temperatures are. And you think, yeah, actually, the further the race goes on, the rear tires are overheating, I'm getting oversteer. What you can actually do is use the heave spring values to make sure that the front ride height comes up more than the back ride height over the space of a race, which under normal conditions would basically make the car more and more understeery as the race goes on. But because you've affected this so the front ride height comes up more than the back ride height, and it's because your rear tires are going off and the car is getting oversteery, the setup is going understeery as time goes on, and you basically can adjust it so that you maintain the same balance throughout the entire race, which is
Pretty
it
cool.
comes in handy. Yeah, it can give you. I've done that before, and it's obvious because a lot of people and officials are going to be using VRS or PDS or something along those lines, and a lot of the time, I don't know if you've noticed that VRS, Julian doesn't, right, the setup's always the tires go bad and he doesn't do anything about it. I guess he just expects people to sort of drive more carefully or something like that. So because so many people in the officials are using VRS, I've noticed before when I've made adjustments like this that will be, I'll be the same speed as somebody at the beginning of the race, and as the race goes on, they start sliding about and I get progressively faster than they are because I've made an adjustment to the setup because in response to what's happening.
So I've got another question. I might not buy the VRS package to get the data out of like you do with the telemetry. Is there a chance to get all the information more or less or roughly by looking at the data that iRacing provides here by spring deflection, shock deflection, or is this rather a useless numbers like 13, 39, 40.6, 30? What do these numbers mean?
You talking about deflections?
Are they for the dampers and the springs, or?
It's just well, there's one for each. There's one for the springs and one for the dampers. Yeah, and there's 6 of them basically because there are 6 springs. And the deflation, I mean, the general rule about deflation is that it's supposed to be that when the fuel is empty, your spring deflation should, well, your deflection, sorry. You can see this one is the shock deflection is at -5, which almost instantly is bad. It means the shock is over extended, which is bad. And you can change that by the perch offsets, so which also changes the ride height. So if you change the perch offset to fix the deflation, some kind of deflation issue, you then have to remember what your ride height was and change it again by using the push rods. So I would say click this a load of times, and you can see the spring, the shock deflection is solving itself, and I've got to 0 or whatever, and then when you put the fuel back in, it should go back up, except I'm obviously doing something wrong here. I'm not quite sure what's going on here. It may be the perch offset at the back. It is the perch offset at the back. These things are really, really fiddly and annoying, but and actually, in a lot of ways, it doesn't matter. But what you're supposed to do to set them up properly is take all the fuel out, set the perch offset so that these things are close to 0. Let's say there. And then when you put the fuel back in, you can see the deflection is happening more because the car weighs more. But in a lot of ways, it doesn't really make too much of a difference. Essentially, if you've got less deflection, say you've got less spring deflection, you've got less travel in the spring, which means essentially the spring needs to be stiffer to stop you from hitting the ground because it's got less distance to travel. So if you hit a bump and you've got your spring setting on a certain stiffness, and that bump makes you lose 9 millimeters of ride height. If your spring only has 8 millimeters of travel, then you're going to get coil binding because you run out of suspension travel, and the car is going to behave really badly and possibly throw you off the road. So sometimes, the car, you'll be making setup changes, and the car starts feeling really weird through certain corners. You're like, what the hell is happening? And then you'll notice that with all the suspension changes you've been made, and your deflection has gone really, really abnormal. And then you just have to muck around with all these numbers to try and get them back to somewhere where they're not going into negative deflection, and they're not overly into positive deflection. Like this here, look, heave damper deflection at the front on this setup, 40 out of 50. So we have 130 millimeters of spring travel, 10 millimeters of damper travel, which is the dumbest shit ever. You're never going to have as much damper travel as you would spring travel anyway. But I would say, just by looking at that, 40 out of 50, that's a massive anomaly, at which I'd go, that can't be good. And so I would start adjusting things to try and bring it back to some kind of normality. Although I wouldn't worry about deflations too much, to be honest. They really don't make much of a difference. It just is better for them not to be completely abnormal.
All right. So a rule of thumb would be first one down, second one as high as you can.
The way generally the F3 is sort of set up normally. I know Luca Varani always goes to that F3 setup manual from real life. Is that you should have loads of spring travel, and you should have less damper travel. Generally. Although it doesn't seem to make too much of a difference.
All right. And the first number should be high, and the second number, like 16.5, ideally you want the number to go down, and 152 you want the number to go up, right? That would be.
Well, no, 152 is going to stay the same because that's just the length of your suspension. The only thing that changes the length of your suspension really are things like the what are they called, packers. So have a look at that when I change the packer value and press apply. Oh no, actually that's not changing. Oh, it's because we've got no heave spring. If there's a heave spring in it, and you can see that's changed. If that's changed to 87.3, if I put that down 2 or 3, actually that's not changed. Oh, so that's only changed the. Sorry, it's changing this number here, the heave deflection. So if I wanted more travel, you get more travel if you have less packers, basically. All the way down to 0, it goes to 60.
All right. So ideally you would have the heave packer thickness always to 0, right? Because you
Ideally, yeah.
Thank you.
The bump rubber, it has a minimum of 5, but the heave packers, unless you're actually using them to try and solve a grounding out problem, I would just always keep them at 0. Certainly, I found before where I've been like, the balance is really nice. I don't really want to affect it, but I am hitting the ground a little bit here and there, and I'll put in some packer thickness. And what it does is it basically undermines the effectiveness of your dampers, and you end up getting like oversteer and stuff. So it's best not to have those at all, really, if you can get away with it. Okay. I'm confused as to what we should do now. Oh, there's something else I can tell you about if you like. There's something actually really crucial that I've neglected to tell you about, but I should really tell you about.
Yeah, go for it. Then I think what would be great is if you made a couple of adjustments from the baseline downforce, and then we did a few laps.
Yeah, because we've just been like rabbiting on for 2 hours now without doing any driving at all. I wasn't expecting that this is how this would go. I thought we would just sort of like make little changes, then we'd go driving. But I've ended up just talking and talking and talking. But the really important thing that I need to tell you, in terms of like adjusting your setup, is the difference between mechanical balance and aero balance. So you might be driving around, and you might think, I've got oversteer. What can I do to fix this oversteer? And you might think, well, I've got this aero balance number here, 43.2, which is completely arbitrary, by the way. It's not really based on anything because it changes if you change these numbers here, which is just a calculator. So all we've got to bear in mind is that it doesn't really matter what this aero balance number is, just whether or not you make it go up or down when you change the wings. So I could say, I really like this number of 40. So I'm going to put this to 20 and this to 26. It is an arbitrary number. It doesn't mean anything other than if you put front wing on it, it's going to go up. And if you take front wing off, it's going to go down. So what you've got to think is you might think, I've got some oversteer. Well, let's say I've got some understeer and I want to fix it. So I'm going to put some front wing on. And you put that up a couple of clicks or something. And you might find that it fixes it, or you might find that it doesn't, because it may not be that your understeer is caused by your wings. It may be that your understeer is caused by your center of mass because of your rake. Let's just set this back to what it was. So 15 at the front, 47 at the back, if that is an extreme number. But yeah, generally the way that you figure this out is basically aero balance is going to be dominant at high speed. Mechanical balance, your rake, your center of mass, whether it's forward or backwards, is going to be dominant at low speed. So if you've got understeer at high speed, you need to change the aero balance forwards. But if you've got understeer at low speed, changing the aero balance won't really help you much. It's most probably mechanical balance. Does that make sense?
What speed is your high speed, low speed?
For example, Degner 1, that's pretty high speed. Going up the... not to say that changing the mechanical balance actually won't help you in some high-speed corners, but it's always good to bear in mind that it's not always the case that changing the wings is really going to help you, because it may not be that the aero balance is the problem. It may be the mechanical balance. So say you're getting some oversteer in some corners, you may want to try just like lowering the rear ride height instead of putting more wing on or changing the wings. Makes sense?
Yep, that makes sense.
Okay, so I'll make some adjustments to this, okay? If I was trying to turn this into... I'm going to want to turn this into a good setup. Let me show you essentially tricks of the trade that really make a difference in how much time you're spending trying to create a setup. So I'm coming into Suzuka. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my setups, and I might go into old and have a look at what I've got. And I've got like loads of Suzukas from last season or whatever. The one that I was using, I guess, was B8. I'm going to load it up, and I'm going to see what wing settings I had. And I had, or I might, what I sometimes do is I cheat by finding the VRS set, because I pay for VRS, so I could use the setup. But I don't want to use the setup because a lot of the time I think I can make a better setup than VRS. But I might go into the VRS setup just to cheat some time back looking at what wing levels he's using, because that just saves me tons of time of experimenting, because you can figure out what the wings are just by changing them a bit, going out, going, no, that might not be enough, changing it again, going out, and this takes laborious amounts of time. So it's much easier just to, like, if you're buying VRS, you might as well have a look at it. And I do the same a lot of the time with, if it's a fresh new track and I haven't got an old setup, for the drivetrain, what the general gearing is, because that takes bloody ages to work out manually. But then you've got like a VRS setup that you pay for, so you might as well look at what gearing he has and just cheat it in. That makes sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it saves just tons and tons of time. We haven't actually talked about differential either, but maybe, I don't know. Okay, so let's go back to the... sorry, it was this, wasn't it? So... Oh, sorry. I'm brain farting right now. Where are we? Suzuka. I had a Suzuka set up. Where is it? Here it is. So B8. What I will generally look at is downforce trim. I'm using 4.5 points of downforce. Pretend this old Suzuka setup I'm using is just like I'm looking at Suzuka VRS, right? And I like, oh yeah, Julian is using 4.5 points of downforce. So I'll load up the one we're modifying, and I can see this is minus 14 points of downforce. And what do I want? 4.5. So let's just say that this is a balanced setup, and you can see the aero balance says 43.2. So I have to keep this number at 43.2 to maintain the aero balance. But I need to change this number, minus 14.1, to the correct level of aero for Suzuka. So I'm just going to basically try and make this 4.5, and I've got to keep this number in my head, 43.2, or I could write it down somewhere. But I've got to remember 43.2. So here we go. I'm going to put the front up a bit, say 22. Try and then change this back to 43.2 by putting the rear up. There we are. And I've got 7.7, so I know that's slightly too much. So take one off the front, take a few off the back, and now we're at 4.4. So that's basically the right amount of downforce, and I've maintained the aero balance. So I now know that more or less that is the correct wing settings, at least a good starting point for the wing settings. I can't remember what the drivetrain was. I'm not even going to bother looking at that at the moment. Just leave the drivetrain as it is. And let's change. Let's do. Let's put a front heave spring in because I want to use the front dampers. I'm actually going to leave the rear. Last season, I was using the third spring at the back. Again, this is overly complicated. I don't know if it, but last season, everyone who was really quick was using an exploit called DRS, right? Except it's a drag reduction system. So this is why, if you look at any of the VRS setups from last year, because Julian, I think, basically looks at everybody else's setups on VRS and goes, "Oh yeah, I'm sure that VRS have the capacity to look at people who are really fast in using VRS and have a look at their setups." And Julian just goes, "Oh, that seems pretty good. Everyone's using that. That must be great." Because what they were doing is having the heave spring maybe on 90 or 70 or something like that. So you've got the front not really wanting to compress, have the back on 0 so that the back will compress. And what this does is when you're going down a straight, the air pressure doesn't push down the front, so the ride height stays high, but it does push down the back. In fact, so much that the ride height at the front ends up as more than the ride height at the back. So say you've got the front at, say, 22.6. As you're going along a straight, this soft rear suspension pushes the ride height at the back down to like 10, which completely gets rid of the ground effect, massively reducing your drag. But when you're going at medium speed through a corner, once you touch the brakes, the ride height at the back, because you've got this soft suspension, pops up and it puts you into positive rake again, and you've now got your ground effect back when you go through the corners. So you may not have realized it, but some of the setups that I was making back in the day had this in it. And I'm sure there's loads of people who are driving like PDS or VRS and stuff don't even realize they've got a form of exploity DRS happening, where they've got a much higher straight line speed than they really should have based on the amount of wing that they've got. Right?
Wow.
Last season, for some reason, the tyre model last season, I was finding that it became so beneficial to have a third spring in terms of how much more speed you can kind of get out of the corners, because the car turns so much better when you're using these rear dampers as well, the heave dampers and everything. That I was using it, but it seems that this new tyre model. Philip, we can hear your wife, mate. Anyway, I don't know. Did anyone want a cup of tea from Philip's wife? Yeah, so it seems that this new tyre model, this is it's yet again getting into the zone where it's actually beneficial to not have a heave spring. So I would leave the heave spring off. I'm going to remove all of the excess fuel that we don't need. I'm going to increase the cambers and reduce the caster. I'm sure you all know that the caster essentially makes the car self-straighten sort of thing. So sometimes it can be beneficial, but also a lower caster essentially shortens your wheelbase and makes the car easier to turn. So I always just like to have a smaller caster. I want the ride height at the front to be conventional, so I'm going to put it down to 15. I'm just going to have the front heave spring on 60 just because I want the front shocks to work. And I know, just through the philosophy of how I do setups nowadays, that I want the ride height at the back to be as low as possible. So I'm going to put it down to like 25.5 or something. So I've got 10 millimeters difference in terms of the rake. These cambers are actually really extreme right now. I don't think we need 4.5. I'm just going to put them down just a couple of clicks just to be sensible. 5.4 is extreme. Does anyone not understand why we put negative toe in on the front? Everyone understand why we put negative toe in on the front?
I don't know.
Is it to make it turn better, isn't it?
It makes it turn better, but do you understand why it turns better?
Yeah, well, the outer tire is turning already.
Yeah. It might be beneficial if I quickly go to Microsoft Paint. I don't know.
Well,
Should I go to Microsoft Paint? I'll just do it really quick.
Go for it. It's just setting up the tire at the right angle when it's going through the corner, right?
it's already turning, so when you get the outer tire to get more pressure, it's gonna, yeah, he's gonna paint now.
You want to turn right. Here comes the car, and toe out is this is extreme, but toe out is the tires going this direction. So if you want to turn right, and you turn the steering wheel a little bit, this tire will now be pointing forwards, and this tire will be pointing like in that direction. So if your tires were both straight and there was no toe in at all, when you turn right, this one tire is going to be like this, and the other tire will be like this. And the problem with that is that the radius of the corner here, or the angle of the corner here, is much more than the angle of the corner here.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
This is a smaller angle on the outside. So you actually need this tire to be pointed more in this direction, and that tire in that direction. So when the tires are when you've got toe out, it sets it up so you're minimizing the scrub of the tires, because one is more pointed inwards towards the corner, because it actually has to turn at a tighter angle because it's closer to the apex than this one, which is doing a larger radius. Yeah.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Thank you.
Hey Sam, quick question.
Yeah.
When you dropped the rear to get rid of the rake, did you not also then change your downforce?
It does change the downforce, yeah. It certainly does change the downforce, yeah. I mean, I bear that in mind if I'm looking like VRS, in that he essentially, I need higher wing angles than he does, because his whole car is pointed into the wind already. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I just wanted to double check that my thinking was
definitely.
correct.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, so
absolutely correct.
Yeah, so you'd have to get the same balance, you'd have to compensate, add rear wing, because you're basically taking off rear wing by lowering.
Well, it's not to do with the balance. The balance changes with both front and back. The angle is changing with the front and the back.
Gotcha.
It's not the balance, it's just the overall level of downforce. But that's certainly true, yeah. Okay, so we're getting somewhere towards a sort of a good starting setup here. The rear cambers I'm going to put to maximum. It's actually going to default to like 4 or 4.2 or something, 4.1? No? I don't know. Something like 4.1. I have found, I didn't get to the end of this, but I have found negative toe in on the back just doesn't work anymore. My Watkins set just had 0. And even when I've been setting up here Donington, I tried a little bit of positive, a little bit of negative. I tried all of these, and I found that 0 is just the best. I don't know why. I'm just going to turn Lucas down. I don't know about you, but his wife is starting to make like weird noises. I can go. It seems I can go a bit higher on the rear. Cambers. Like that. That'll be fine. Notice the ride height has changed now, so I'm going to use the push rod to put that back up to 25.5 or whatever the hell I had it on. Normally, you can see they've been doing weird stuff with the rear. Actually, we're not using a third spring, so there are no rear dampers at all. so that these values don't matter. 5.5 I think is fine on the back, because we'll see how it handles and then use the graph to see whether or not we need to change that. The rear really is the rear shocks are really the thing that you change the most to change the handling in my experience, because nearly always it's best just to have something like 2.8 on the front on all of them, because that helps you turn in, bearing in mind that with the low rate concept that I generally use, the weight is transferred to the back to help the stability on the rear end, and that will really help in Suzuka actually, especially like up the hill and through the S's. You're throwing the car about, it means you can throw the car more without the rear losing grip, but it does mean that it provides a lot of understeer. I mean, I think Julian likes the high rate because it gives him like a really good front end. So these damper settings on the front, give you don't stop the front from compressing too much, so you get lots of initial turn in, and the rebound damper stops the front end from coming back again, which means that turn in continues for a long time into the corner. And it may be that we end up with these modifications with a little bit of corner exit understeer, in which case we can adjust the cambers at the back to adjust the shocks at the back to deal with that. Right now, all of the springs are on minimum, which used to be the fastest way to do it. 2 seasons ago, it was just a no-brainer. What you would do is you would just put everything on soft. But then iRacing obviously realized that that's just broken, and they did something to the tire model to make that not work anymore. So what I would generally start off with is just over 13. I'm going to go like 13.25 just to see what it's like. And I'm going to adjust the ride height back to 15. And on the back, I would do something similar. I would normally put it to like 158, 166. Let's go with 158. Again, the ride height now needs to go back down by quite an extreme amount. 50.4. And we're nearly there, because we've done our wings. We've done most of the things at the back. The ARBs possibly are. Let's see what they've got on the front here. Yeah, generally you'll see in most setups that the ARBs are all on like the softest they would go. So I put these all on soft. That's on soft already, and I put that down to the softest position on the back. Put this just somewhere in the middle. 2.4 is absolutely fine. This is just sort of making through experience what are generally the best setup values, and just sort of putting the car in a sort of like a neutral position that we can then have a go with and see whether it's actually any good or not. And then lastly, I'll just change the diff. And let me share a little secret with you, seeing as Marcus is here as well. Marcus, when we were working on our Watkins Glen setup, I was doing okay. I always used to love this setup on the diff. I would have 80, 80, and 80, or maybe 75. And I think because it was so slippery, we had this down at maybe 65 or even 55. But always 80, 80, because I really love 80, 80, and 80, 80 was fantastic. But for some reason, the car was feeling really skittish, and it was like not behaving very well. And Marcus suddenly realized that 3060 was absolutely amazing, and actually made the car feel more like it used to feel before we had this weird new tire model. Whereas before, I would hardly ever go anywhere near 3060 because it just had way too much like oversteer and entry and exit. But for some reason, with this tire model, 3060 seems to be the best rather than 8080, and I don't know why.
What's the difference between those numbers?
Well, essentially, it's actually one of these things I don't understand that well. But I've always just found that the lower the number, the more the oversteer. So, like,
basically
the first number is entry, corner entry. The second number is corner exit, or other coast and drive. So when you're off the accelerator, when you're braking, it's the first number, and the drive is when you're coming on the accelerator on the outside. Go, Chris.
Oh yeah, no, I was just saying that higher number locks the axle more. Pretty much.
Yeah.
So it's stiffer.
I'm not convinced that it's really that realistic in iRacing, though, to be honest. I don't really know, but a lot of these things, in a lot of ways, this is, not real. So there are exploits to be found, not because they're realistic, if you know what I mean.
Oh, tell me about it.
Yeah. Chris, just in case you don't know, Chris loves a little advantage. Chris loves an unfair advantage, And
It's
who
all
wouldn't?
legal.
All completely legal. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and something. Let me tell you something else about the process. I'm quite methodical how I do all of this. Generally, I always follow like the same kind of process where I have a starting point. I go and create some data. I then look at the data and think about what it is I want to achieve, and I try and create a balance. And then I go out again and I create more data, and then I start scratching my head thinking about individual corners and how I was feeling, and that sort of thing. I'm very methodical in how I do it. But the most important thing about doing this is saving the setups. You may have noticed that my setups go things like A1, A2, A3, A4, then B1, B2, B3, whatever. So I have made this setup now, and I think it's a neutral, probably handling like shit setup, but I'm going to save it as Suzuka A1. And now this will never change. This will always be Suzuka A1. I'm going to go and have, let's go out and drive it, and then look at the data and any changes that I make to then go and drive again. So every time, just before I go out to drive, I will save it as a new file. Should we actually do some driving? I'm going to share it with everybody.
Sounds good.
We've got like half an hour left. And this is probably going to handle like absolute shit. And no one else is going to come out driving because I've put everybody to sleep.
I'll always be here.
Yeah, I think we're all here.
Any chance to punt Sam?
Can immediately feel the turn in.
The understeer is amazing. The grinding out on the floor is interesting. And remember, everybody, that the idea of what we're doing with these laps is not to go ultimately fast, but to create good data to look at later. So just calm, nice laps without going off the track.
Did you send a copy of that setup somewhere, Sam?
I shared it with the whole server, so it should be in shared in garage. You go into shared and you should see it.
Oh, in iRacing. Sorry, I didn't understand.
Do you see it, Ron?
I'm just checking right now. I was trying to find it on Discord. Yeah, I did find it. Thanks, Sam.
Bet Chris is using the meme setup.
No, the lap I set earlier, the 52 was on my old one. My own one from last season. Just giving it a run.
Right, when you've all happy that you've set a lap with your tyre temperatures have come up and everything, then we'll look at the graphs, and I think that'll probably be us for this session at least, because I've probably talked for too long already.
We're in a VRS team, right?
Sorry?
Us two are in a VRS team, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I was just wondering. Because maybe you can look at my lap from earlier in the session, see if there's any differences.
There's an iGP team if you want to get in that too.
Yeah, I actually left the IGP team because of the World Cup. I didn't want people spying on our setup.
Yeah, I noticed.
Top secret, basically, and it worked. I think we had a really good setup, mostly because Marcus is a fucking Einstein god.
I'm here listening. Yeah, I'm listening. just look.
See, Marcus's approach to setup is like going duck hunting with a flamethrower.
I like it.
Like, you're definitely going to kill the duck, you know? And probably take down the forest at the same time. In fact, you'll kill everything. Okay, so just waiting for Dirk to finish his lap and...
You got me this
Ron.
time, Adam. You got me this time.
But Sam, you've been a legend in helping me get quicker in the last, I don't know, six weeks or something like that. I really appreciate the time that you spent going through the setups with me, doing the similar thing. And also Chris as well has helped me with my braking and stuff like that. So I can't thank these guys enough for helping out. Never asked for anything. I appreciate that, boys. And I appreciate everyone else in the league as well, who races nice and fair and clean and hard, and love racing with you all. Good, I'm going to get off now, so I'll speak to you all later. See you soon.
Okay, see ya.
See ya.
Take care, Marcus.
Yep, see ya.
Right, is everybody ready to look at the graph?
Yeah, I'm good.
Yep, we are.
Has anyone got any feedback initially? They could say what they felt was wrong with the car. I mean, I know exactly what was wrong with the car personally, but I was wondering if anybody else can feel what was going wrong there with that setup. Without looking, before we look at the graph.
I felt a little oversteer on entry, but I always do. I don't know, it's probably just my driving.
Anything else? Okay.
There.
Can everyone see the graph?
Yeah.
So if you remember, we put basically the cambers on maximum, just as a kind of initial thing to do to see what the data looks like. So you can see this, like, compared to the other lap we did. Let's look at that again. That was the other lap we did, right? And you can see like all of the lines are together, and you've got this anomaly here where the middle is highest and all sorts of crap going on here. And then compare it to the one that I just did there, where the lines are much better separated. So you can see definitely the inner part of the tire is definitely hottest, which is what we wanted. The middle is a lot of the time, like here, closer to the top line, and then you've got the outer, which is a lot cooler, and that's more or less fine. The only thing being is that on the rears, for example, here, you can see how much hotter the inside is to the middle, which means that the tire is actually leaning over too much. So it's like it's being more on the inside of the tire than we want it to be. So that means that the rear cambers are slightly too high. And I think we had them on like 40, well, minus 4.1, was it? Something like that. So I would just put it down a couple of clicks. Hang on, let me just double check. What do we have it on? We have it on minus 4.2.
Yes.
So I would put that down a couple of clicks to like minus 4, right? And then in the next set of data, I'd see if that has fixed this problem, hoping that really what you ideally want is the inner and the middle to be very close together and the blue one to be lower. So it would close this gap that we can see here, particularly at high loads. You look at the highest load, which is here, where the tire's getting hottest, those lines should be really together. So there's too much camber on the back. You could almost say that's true for the front. I mean, looking at the highest load here, this still looks like a bit of an anomaly. There's a few anomalies going on here, but the fronts kind of look okay. If anything, slightly too much camber on the front as well. So if anything, actually, I might put the back to minus 3.9. So put it down 3 clicks, put the front down 2 clicks, and then do some more tire data. But generally, yeah.
We didn't touch on tire pressure. How does that work into this?
That's a good point, actually, because we just did that entire stint with the tire pressures up. No, we didn't. They're all on minimum. That's fine. Yeah, the tire pressures just be on minimum, just like it is in Formula One. They always just want lower tire pressure as you could possibly get. And in iRacing, it's always been the case that you just have it on the lowest you could possibly put it.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. That's good to know.
Yeah, yeah. Anything else is slower. It shouldn't be. What you should do in real life is have equal pressures on all tires. So you can see on this graph, albeit only after 3 laps, that at the end of this lap, for example, the rears are on 34, the fronts are on 32. So if you wanted to actually have a balanced car, you could say it would be better to have 2 more bars of pressure in the front, so they're all 134. Certainly when it comes to, so you might go around the track and for loads of laps, and you'll find that the left rear is 140 and the right rear, say, 135. In real life, it would be better to put 5 more into the right rear so that both the rears are on 140 and therefore the car is balanced. In iRacing, that doesn't work. You just need them all on minimum pressures for some reason.
Okay, thanks.
So yeah, so that we've just looked at the graph and we've come up with an idea of how to make this better based on the temperature data. The thing I was definitely feeling, and it is so obvious, and you can understand why, in that we have the rear ride height so low and we have no rear heave spring, is that just look at these ride heights. Here, for example, down the straight, we are completely beneath the ground. So this is no good. This is seriously affecting our straight line speed. You see the left rear and the right rear, or at least, no, sorry, left and the right rear, yeah, sorry, both on this side. I'm just going to pause iRacing. Yeah, so we have to do something about that. And what I would suggest is raising the ride height, but for both the front and the back. So we keep the same balance, so we're not affecting the balance, because that's not the issue we're addressing. We could try, seeing as this is going beneath the ground. Actually, that's just a bit of an anomaly and a bit of a bump. But generally, we're going beneath the ground by 2 to 3 millimeters. Where's the back straight? The back straight is here. Yeah, here as well. Same problem, that we are massively just like all the way along the back straight. The car is in the ground and it's limiting our top speed. So I would maybe raise, rather than having 15.5 at the front or wherever we had. What did we have? We had like 15 at the front, 25 at the back. I would put the front on 17.5 and the back on 27.5. So we maintain this 10 millimeters difference, keep the same rake, but raise the ride height. And if that doesn't solve the problem, then we could do other things like increasing the spring rate, make the suspension stiffer. And if that still doesn't work, which I'm sure it actually would, because again, it turns out a lot of the time it's better just to let the car hit the ground a little bit. But it's certainly not good to have the car trailing down the straight, always hitting the ground. That's bad. But the odd little bump here and there is fine. But you should solve that pretty easily by stiffening the suspension slightly and raising the ride height. Just making sure that you try and keep everything else constant, like the rake and everything. And then, of course, you would do some more laps, have a look at the graph again, and see if you've solved the problem. Or you should realize instantly, actually, if you solve the problem, because you'll suddenly be like 5 kilometers an hour faster down the back straight.
Can we? Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say, can we have a look at the dampers as well?
Yeah, I was just going to move on to the dampers, have a look what they look like. So the front dampers are looking a hell of a lot healthier than with the other setup, just because they are obviously. I don't know if you remember what it was like. Let's have a look. Yeah, so there's like not very much data here because there's not very much like fast movement in the suspension, which means it's not really doing anything over the bumps sort of thing. It's not the suspension and the dampers and stuff just not really doing anything to really smooth anything out. Whereas here you can see, I would say it just sort of looks healthier. There's more data. There's more like micro movements, and it's also quite. I would look here for an anomaly, and the anomaly here is that the it's saying that the bump damper is too. Well, we've got a mixture of problems actually, and actually I keep getting these with my setup. I think it's maybe to do with the ride height or something. I don't know, but we've got the. It's basically saying that the rebound on the front is too soft, although it doesn't really look like that because there's that one, and that's higher than that one, and that's higher than that one. Yeah, I'm not actually convinced that this. I've become convinced actually in the last few days that there's something wrong with the damper histogram in VRS, but it's probably just me, to be honest, because it keeps telling me that my bump dampers are too stiff, but we have the front bumps all on 2. I've still yet to figure out what the fuck is going wrong with that, to be honest. I was mucking around with Donington's setup the other day, and I was ripping my hair out trying to solve this. But in a lot of ways, it's kind of okay, and as long as the car feels okay, I think that's all right. But anyway, this graph is telling me that maybe the rebounds are too soft, or the compression is too hard. But I'm not convinced. I think it might be an anomaly of the curbs or something like that. I don't really know actually, to be honest. But at least there's not like a massive crazy anomaly that we're looking at there and thinking, oh shit, something really doesn't look right there. The bar in the middle is tallest, and these again, as long as the car feels okay, you don't need to worry about it too much. But anyway, what else can we say about this? Not a lot. Sometimes I use this wheel slip and spin to work out whether the brake balance is okay. This basically shows like lockups that you're having during your lap. So this is the fronts locking up, and this is the rears locking up, and the rears aren't actually locking up at all. It looks more extreme on this graph over to the right, but if you look at the scale, that's minus 5% is the maximum. Whereas here, the fronts are locking up minus 30%, and even these small things are minus 10%. Yeah.
On your brake bias, do you change that during the race? I heard some people do, but I wasn't sure if that's something that you guys are actually doing.
Yes, I definitely do that. I do with this particular tire model now. Previous tire model last season, the tires were really, really robust and they just weren't heating up at all. If anything, the problem last season was that the tires weren't heating up and you had to do like extreme things with the cambers to make them get some heat into them. This season seems to be similar to what it was the season before last, where the rears do actually heat up quite a lot. So like during Watkins Glen officials, for example, or even during the World Cup, as soon as I got to sort of lap 5 or 6, and I started to feel that the back was getting slightly loose, I would go 3 clicks forward on the brake bias. I'd started off at 54.8, and I'd click it forward 3 times, and then that would generally settle it down for a bit. And then if it started to happen again and the rear started to get loose, because maybe it's because I was pushing too hard or whatever, but either way, if that got loose, I would put like 3 clicks forward again, and it took me up to 56.8 or something like that. And generally, when you get to like 56.8, it sort of stabilizes and it's kind of fine. You're not really overheating the rears so much. Also, a good thing to bear in mind is that if you're doing qualifying, lots of people sort of like weave about on their outlap and stuff to try and get temperature into their front tires, but it's not really going to get temperature into your rear tires, nor is burning out with your rear tires doesn't actually create as much heat as you think it does, but it does take the edge off your tires. You can take like 2% off your back tires, which lessens the grip that they have. So a good way, if you're going out on a qualifying lap, a good way to do it is to weave about to warm up your front tires. But when you want to warm up your rear tires, I put my rear put the brake bias rearwards to about 51 or something, and then if I'm going along a straight, I will brake heavily, and then start accelerating again, and then brake heavily again, because you put your brake bias backwards, that is what really drives heat into your rear tires. You know what I mean?
That's good to know.
No, that's awesome.
As long as you
So much
remember,
info taken.
you've got to remember to put your brake bias forwards again when you start the race, otherwise you're going to spin out in the first corner. If you know what I mean. But yeah, so yes, I do adjust the brake bias a lot. There are some tracks where I think, oh my god, it's got to be beneficial to change my brake bias for different corners. And occasionally, if I'm feeling like I want to be like hyper competitive in qualifying, I might change the brake bias for different corners sometimes, as you're going around like a Formula One driver does. But I certainly don't do that during the race because it's just too much effort.
Yeah, the World Cup, I didn't change it at all, so I just left it at the same setting the whole race.
Yeah. I mean, you could definitely feel it. I could definitely feel it in the World Cup that, and just in Watkins Glen in general with this new tire model, that when I do move my brake bias forwards, it really does slow my lap time down, just simply because I'm reliant on that quite a lot to get a little bit of extra oversteer into some of the corners, particularly corners like that really cambered right-hander, for example. I can't remember what it is, turn 7 turn 7, I think it is. If you know what I mean, in Watkins Glen.
Yeah, exactly. I thought I was overheating my rears. That's why my rear, but it's probably because I had too much brake bias.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe. Any questions? I think we should probably end this now because it's gone on for far too long. And I think I've given you the basics, maybe? I don't know.
No, that's definitely a great foundation for us to work from.
But you've got to be methodical, and you've got to sort of let the data speak to you, especially when you're talking about tire temperatures, ride heights. At some point, I'm going to get to the bottom of this, which I'm sure is an anomaly. I need to basically check the dampers, I think, in a proper telemetry program to see if this is actually happening, because I've got a feeling that this is an anomaly in the VRS data, because it keeps happening to me, but it can't be true. What this graph is telling me cannot be true, basically. So I've got to check it in like Motec or something. I really don't know. But anyway, the main things you really want to be concentrating on that are like the basis of your thing. Oh, actually, before we finish, let me just finish off with a few things that I would say about in terms of altering the balance. What am I doing? Hang on. We go back to iRacing. Right. So, say for example, we just went out and I was feeling like I'd more or less got my setup feeling okay in general, and I've sorted out the ride height problem and all of that kind of stuff. And now I'm thinking, well, through the first corner, it's not really turning in enough. Or on the exit, I don't know if you noticed there, but on the exit of the second corner, it was quite difficult to get on the power. Did anyone else notice that?
Yeah,
I did. Yeah,
you could do with a little bit more exit turning. What I would essentially do is reduce or make the rebound on the rear dampers make the rebound generally a little bit smaller, softer, and the compression a little bit higher. The extreme version of this, and you'll see it in the Watkins Glen setup, I think. I'm not sure if we kept it that way, but it's like 8.2 on the front, 2.8 on the front, 8.2 on the back. Now this produces turn in, oversteer on the way in, and oversteer on the way out. If I had a normal rake setup, so the ride height at the back was actually quite high, like 38, like Julian has it, this would make us spin out nearly every time. But because I think personally that just with the way that the F3 is, the lower rake is really good in terms of reducing your drag and making the car more stable. It sort of forces these quite extreme damper settings. So this let the 2 at the front lets the front go down and bite. The 8 rebound keeps the front down, so you get good mid corner. Obviously the rear goes up during your braking phase. The compression dampening at 8 keeps the rear up through the mid corner, and the rebound damping essentially that allows, when you're braking, that allows the back to suddenly jump up to that high position. So putting that to 8 and that to 2 would probably actually make the damper graph look like shit, but you would suddenly find that you have amazing abilities to turn out of a corner, and you can get on the accelerator mode. So, and if you find that you've got too much, you could bring this down to 6 and this up to 4, even it out a little bit. Same as you could do with the front. If you decide that it actually helps you to put an extra click of wing or 2 on the front, but it's a little bit too much turn in now, but you kind of like the way that it feels, then you could possibly then put this up to 4 and this down to 6. And you might find that balance is better. But it's all about your personal preference. It might be better that you like the dampers more aggressive and the wing slightly less aggressive, or you like the wing slightly less aggressive. You like to produce a little bit of understeer with the wing and produce a little bit of oversteer by bringing up the rear ride height. So these are things that are basically just down to individual preference, like the balance between how you're making the car turn with the dampers versus how you're making the car turn with the rake versus how you're making the car turn with the wings. But often the wings are, again, as I mentioned earlier on, mostly like high speed, and the rake is mostly low speed. I haven't spoken at all about ARBs, anti-roll bars, but I generally find that they hardly make any difference at all. They just, if I've got understeer, I don't even bother going to the ARBs. I find it just makes hardly any difference at all. So I could go, oh, I'm going to stick this on 1.3, and that's going to give me loads more corner potential going into the corner. I don't really find that it makes that much difference. Sometimes it just gives you these like weird flat slides where you've got a bit, it feels like you've got like more turn in, and then suddenly it gives out. So I found it's much better to have like better structural mechanical grip using the dampers and the ride heights that way than it is ever by using the ARBs.
I've noticed that at Watkins Glen after the carousel, the left-hander, I get a good turn in, and like you said, I get a slide, and then I sort of catch it, and I always sort of compensate for that. I always expect that slide, and it's because I softened up the arb on the setup I was using.
Yeah.
That explains
Do
it.
you go down to 3rd?
No, I stay in 4th there.
Okay, that's good. 4th is so much quicker through there.
Yeah, that's what I found too.
Yeah.
I find the F3s are pretty torquey down low in the RPM range. So being up a higher gear is fine.
Yeah. The only thing I do occasionally try out. The rear ARB definitely makes a difference. So sometimes if you're thinking the balance feels okay, but I feel like if you're making like a qualifying setup and you think I want just a little bit more turn in, I want the rear a bit looser, you can chuck this one on position 2 or position 3. You find that actually makes a difference. But I would say that you get much more long-term like race speed by having this at position 1 and the softest it will go, just keeping more traction on the back. But you can loosen it up a little bit if it feels a bit. But I mean, once you start loosening up the back, I always find that certainly with this tire model, you don't want the back moving about because the tires overheat so quickly and they wear out so quickly. The only thing I have done with quite a lot of success with this current tire model is I find actually that a lot of the time it's quicker having both of these on medium. And this is actually a good way to test out different ARB settings without actually changing the positions of the blades, like without changing like this about. So say keep this on 24 all the time, keep this on position 1 all the time, and try out whether you prefer this on medium or both of them on stiff. You might try and find out actually that it just feels better. You'll certainly actually get better tire life with this on stiff or medium because you're not allowing the car to press the tire into the ground so much. It will make you slower over a single lap, but it will give you your tires much longer life. So I was definitely found that at Watkins Glen. For a while I was thinking about just keeping them both on stiff, but I found actually that it lowered my ultimate lap time so much it wasn't actually worth it with the tire life, so I ended up putting them on both on medium. But I don't think soft on there is actually quicker anymore. I think medium is actually the best setting for both of those. Like keeping this on long, having this on medium, and just basically just not even bothering with the blades whatsoever. And of course you can make much more of a, like for example, if you put this on soft and had the back on medium, that actually makes a difference to the balance. Whereas the blades I find don't really do anything personally. Also, obviously, the front, the suspension makes a big change to the balance. So if you want more turn in, you could try lowering the suspension. Obviously, remember softening the front suspension just a little bit. But remember, you've got to put the ride heights back to what they were. But generally, I found that the suspension settings are based on like not necessarily really the thing you should be changing to change the balance, because the spring rates seem to be, sort of like the harmonics of what the track is doing, what the track is like, rather than trying to use it as a balance change. You'll find that you get more overall lap time just by having the settings either stiffer or softer, depending on how bumpy the track is and just how the bumps are. So generally, rather than when I'm making a setup, I don't like go, I'm going to soften the front and see if that gives me better front end grip. What I do is I go, I wonder if this track will be better if I put one click on the front and one click on the back and make the whole car stiffer, or take 2 clicks off the back and take 2 clicks off the front, and then see if that makes the car quicker. That's how I use the suspension settings.
That's good to know. I usually just lower the rear because I always I have trouble with loose setups, so I usually just do the spring rate, lower that a little bit, but I've gotten a lot more knowledge of the damping now.
Yeah, and you'll find that you have no problems with that anymore with this third spring being off.
Gotcha. Great.
Because this 0 on the third spring, this creates a whole ton of understeer.
Yeah.
The problem last season, and why I was using the 150 and switching this on last season, was because it was actually really difficult to properly get the car to turn through the corners for some reason. So I was finding I was switching that on, and then I was chucking using the dampers here as well, and that suddenly was enabling me to carry so much more speed through the corners But for some reason with this tire model, it doesn't seem to really help you. It kind of does help you. I was trying it at Donington with the rear spring. And it does help you, but the extra straight line speed you get from having this on 0, in the fact like we were talking earlier on, when you're going along a straight, the back end drops and you just basically get loads less drag. Is so much more beneficial, especially at tracks like Suzuka, where you've got like so many long straights.
Right.
And I think that's it really. I can't think of anything else that I really muck around with too much to actually change the balance. Obviously then the brake bias. We didn't actually talk about the brakes, but that's one of the things that most people know all about anyway.
You touch the cylinders, like the front and rear master cylinder?
I never touch those, no. I can't remember where they are. They're here, yeah. I never touch them. I always find that if I move that about, then it's crap. In order to stop the tires from locking up, I adjust the Joy Calib file. So I have my brake on, like the maximum setting on my pedals are like 65,000. And I have the brake on, I think, 85,000, which means that when I depress the brake, let's see, is it actually going? Oh no, the session has finished, so it's not going to let me drive. But when I depress the brake, if I put the brake on full, it doesn't go to 100%.
Yeah,
it goes to like 8.
On that.
Yeah, so that basically does the same thing as messing with those. But I just find I just leave those as they are, and I adjust the Joy Calib file, and I do adjust it for individual tracks.
Yeah, everything I read about that is it's more about personal preference and the brake pedals you're using and stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, people with like really expensive pedals can actually just like change that physically, can't they? With like the little pressure chambers, whatever they have, how they have them.
Yeah, I would assume so. Yeah.
Yeah. So there we go. Sorry that was weird. I thought that we'd do more driving and less talking, but I ended up basically just lecturing you all for like 2 hours straight, and I think half the people left. But I hope that was
I thought it was
useful.
I thought it was great.
I think you got more out of it learning about the settings than just doing a couple settings and driving on with the car. I can do that on my own time, right? Just trying to figure out what they do and why you do it and kind of what you guys are doing so that I can try that on my own.
Yeah. And believe me, balancing out your cambers using the temperature graph is much more beneficial than you could imagine.
That's
just
good.
because it you know, you're basically creating more contact patch, so you have like much more grip. And another thing you've got to bear in mind is that if you look at your temperature graph for your tires and you're thinking the fronts look fine, the temperature looks fine, but the rears looks like I've got too much camber, and you reduce the camber, that's creating more contact patch on the rear, which will give you understeer. And that's a good sign that you've now got more rear grip. And it's actually a good way to sort of test the cambers on the front as well. You could be like, if I reduce them, do I get more grip, or do I get understeer or oversteer?
Yeah.
So do I get more grip or less grip? And the idea is you sort of muck around with them to try and produce as much grip as possible, and then adjust other things to affect the balance, like the dampers and the rake and the wing aero.
Great, Sam. This has been amazing. Honestly, thank you so much.
Really appreciate this, Sam.
Yeah, it's no problem. And if anyone starts mucking around with it and you get to like an impasse and you're thinking, I don't understand that, just text me on Discord and I'm happy to help.
Yeah.